In the grim darkness of the far future, there is a truth that haunts the Imperium of man above all others. The architects of humanity's greatest betrayal were once its most faithful sons. The Word-Bearers Legion, the 17th Legion of the Adeptus Astartes, holds the cursed distinction of being first in all things that would doom the galaxy. First to find their Primarch, first to worship the Emperor as a god, first to fall to chaos, and ultimately, first to orchestrate the corruption that would tear the Imperium apart in the bloodiest civil war the galaxy has ever known. Picture this scene, if you dare. A cathedral city stretching beyond the horizon, its spires reaching toward heaven like the prayers of billions. Golden aquilas gleam from every surface, and the air thrums with the sound of 10 million voices raised in worship of the god Emperor. This is Monarchia, the perfect city, built by the Word-Bearers as their greatest offering to their divine father. But something is wrong. The sky burns orange with descending drop pods. Blue and white armor emerges from landing craft. The Ultramarines have come, and they carry fire. As the perfect city burns and the Word-Bearers are forced to their knees in shame, their Primarch Lorgar weeps tears of confusion and betrayal. The Emperor, the being he has worshipped as divine for decades, stands before him in golden majesty and speaks words that will echo through 10,000 years of darkness. "You have disappointed me, my son." In that moment, the most faithful legion begins its journey toward becoming the most damned. But this is not just a story of one legion's fall. This is the story of how absolute faith, when betrayed, becomes absolute heresy. The Word-Bearers were different from their brother legions from the very beginning. While others conquered with bolt and blade, the 17th Legion conquered with sermons and scriptures. They built cathedrals on every world they claimed, not just to honor the Emperor but because they genuinely believed he was a god worthy of worship. Their devotion was so complete, so pure, that it became their greatest weakness. For in the dark universe of Warhammer 40,000, the gods are real, and they are hungry. What the Word-Bearers would discover in the depths of space would change everything. Ancient powers that had waited millions of years for such devoted servants would whisper promises of true divinity. The Chaos Gods, beings of pure malevolent will, would offer Lorgar and his sons something the Emperor never could: divine truth that embraced their worship rather than rejecting it. But the price of this revelation would be the souls of the Word-Bearers themselves, and ultimately, the soul of the galaxy. The irony cuts deeper than any blade. Today, in the 41st millennium, the Emperor is indeed worshipped as a god by trillions of Imperial citizens. The Imperial Cult that the Word-Bearers created in their devotion has become the dominant religion of human space. Lorgar's vision came true, but not in the way he ever intended. The god he helped create sits rotting on a golden throne, neither fully alive nor truly dead, while his sons burn as living sacrifices to keep the Astronomicon lit, and Terra protected from the very forces that Lorgar unleashed upon the galaxy. This is a tale of theological horror on a galactic scale. It begins with the noblest of intentions, and ends with the damnation of billions. It shows us how faith without wisdom becomes fanaticism, how love without understanding becomes obsession, and how the greatest virtues of the human spirit can be twisted into the darkest sins imaginable. The Word-Bearers were not evil men who chose corruption. They were good men who chose faith so absolute that it consumed them entirely. But to understand how the galaxy's most devoted sons became its greatest betrayers, we must go back to the beginning. Back to an age when the Great Crusade was young, and the Emperor's dream of a united humanity seemed within reach. Back to a time when hope still existed in the void between the stars, and the shadows that would eventually consume everything were only just beginning to stir in the dark spaces between realities. In the early centuries of the 30th millennium, the Great Crusade represented humanity's greatest gamble with destiny. The Emperor of mankind had emerged from the ashes of old Earth, with a vision so audacious it bordered on madness: to unite every scattered fragment of humanity under one banner, to reclaim the stars that had been lost during the Age of Strife, and to build an empire that would endure for all eternity. This was to be a golden age of reason, science, and enlightenment, where superstition and religion would be swept away by the cold light of empirical truth. The imperial truth, as it came to be known, formed the philosophical foundation of this new order. Humanity would be guided by logic, not faith, by science, not superstition, by the proven facts of material reality, not the dangerous delusions of spiritual belief. The emperor himself embodied this principle, presenting himself not as a god to be worshipped, but as the pinnacle of human evolution, a being who had transcended the limitations of mortality through knowledge and will rather than divine intervention. Yet, across the galaxy, on 10,000 worlds reclaimed from isolation and barbarism, old habits died hard. Humanity had always been a species that reached towards something greater than itself. In the long night of the Age of Strife, when warp storms had cut off world from world and civilization had collapsed into feudal fragments, people had turned to faith as their only source of hope and meaning. They had built religions around half-remembered fragments of ancient knowledge, worshipped the ghostly memories of lost technologies, and created pantheons from the shadows of their fears and dreams. The conquest fleets of the Great Crusade encountered this religious diversity on every world they brought into compliance. Some planets worshipped machine gods that bore suspicious resemblance to standard template construct patterns. Others had built elaborate mythologies around their ruling classes, treating genetic nobility as literal divine mandate. Still others had fallen into stranger beliefs, worshipping abstract concepts like entropy or void, or building cults around phenomena that imperial scientists would later classify as minor warp manifestations. The standard approach to these religious systems was systematic dismantlement. Imperial truth cadres would arrive in the wake of conquest to educate the population about the superiority of scientific rationalism. Temples would be converted to schools and libraries. Priests would be retrained as teachers and administrators. The old gods would be explained away as misunderstood natural phenomena or primitive attempts to categorize pre-industrial technology. It was a process that worked, mostly, though it required constant vigilance and occasional harsh measures to prevent backsliding into superstitious practices. But the imperial truth faced a fundamental contradiction that its architects had failed to fully consider. The Great Crusade itself was led by beings who seemed to transcend every natural law that science claimed to understand. The emperor possessed powers that appeared miraculous to any rational observer. He could project his consciousness across vast distances, manipulate matter with thought alone, and inspire loyalties so absolute that entire armies would die at his word without question. The Primarchs, his genetically crafted sons, were equally impossible by the standards of material science. Each possessed capabilities that seemed to violate basic principles of biology, psychology, and physics. How could rational people be expected to look upon such beings and not see divinity at work? How could the imperial truth explain the existence of creatures who embodied everything that religion claimed about the nature of godhood? The official position was that these were simply examples of advanced science, the products of genetic engineering and psychic manipulation techniques that would someday be understood and replicated through proper research and development. But to populations emerging from millennia of technological dark age, the distinction between sufficiently advanced science and actual magic was essentially meaningless. This tension was most pronounced among the Space Marine legions themselves. These warriors had been created through processes that bordered on the alchemical, using genetic material harvested from beings who seemed to exist beyond the normal limitations of human potential. They possessed capabilities that made them living legends, able to survive injuries that would kill normal humans, to process information at superhuman speeds, and to inspire both terror and awe in everyone they encountered. Yet they were expected to embody the principles of the imperial truth, to serve as examples of scientific achievement rather than objects of religious veneration. Some legions handled this contradiction better than others. The Iron Hands embraced the mechanical aspects of their enhancement, viewing themselves as perfected fusion of flesh and technology. The Imperial Fists found purpose in the practical applications of their abilities, becoming master builders and fortifiers who could point to concrete achievements as evidence of their worth. The Ultramarines developed comprehensive theoretical frameworks that integrated their enhanced capabilities into larger systems of governance and military doctrine. But for other legions, the tension between their superhuman nature and the imperial truth's materialist philosophy created deeper problems. Warriors who had been lifted so far above baseline humanity naturally began to question their place in the cosmic order. If they were not divine, then what were they? If their abilities were merely scientific rather than spiritual, then why did their very existence seem to violate the natural laws that science claimed to represent? And most troublingly, if the emperor who created them was not a god, then how could they explain the absolute devotion they felt toward him? a loyalty so complete that it seemed to transcend rational choice. These questions would prove particularly corrosive to the 17th Legion. Unlike their brother legions, who had been recruited primarily from technologically advanced worlds or societies with strong martial traditions, the word-bearers drew their numbers from populations that had maintained strong religious traditions throughout the Age of Strife. Their homeworlds and recruitment territories were places where faith had never fully died, where the spiritual dimension of human experience remained vibrant despite the advance of Imperial truth doctrine. As the Great Crusade progressed and the contradictions within Imperial ideology became more apparent, it was perhaps inevitable that some of the Emperor's sons would begin to seek alternative explanations for their existence and purpose. The galaxy was vast, and humanity's understanding of its mysteries remained fragmentary despite all the achievements of the Crusade. In the dark spaces between the stars, older powers stirred, beings that had watched the rise and fall of countless civilizations, and understood the true nature of belief and worship in ways that the Imperial truth could never comprehend. The stage was being set for a confrontation between faith and reason that would tear the galaxy apart. But first, there would need to be a champion of faith so pure and devoted that his eventual fall would serve as an object lesson in the dangers of absolute belief. That champion was already walking among the stars, bringing worlds into compliance through the power of his sermons and the devotion of his sons. His name was Lorgar, and he was about to discover that the universe contained truths far more terrible than anything the Imperial truth had ever imagined. The discovery of Lorgar Aurelian marked a turning point not just for the 17th Legion, but for the entire trajectory of human history. Unlike his brother Primarchs, who would be found decades or even centuries later, Lorgar was among the first to be reunited with the Emperor, his recovery occurring within the opening phases of the Great Crusade itself. This timing would prove crucial, for it meant that Lorgar's influence would shape the Crusade's early character in ways that would echo through the millennia. The world of Colchis, where Lorgar had grown to manhood, bore little resemblance to the industrial powerhouses or martial societies that would birth other Primarchs. Instead, it was a world consumed by religious fervor, where competing faiths had waged theological wars for generations before Lorgar's arrival. The planet's surface was dotted with massive temples, each dedicated to different interpretations of divine truth, their spires reaching toward heaven as monuments to humanity's eternal need to touch something greater than itself. When the infant Primarch had crashed onto this world in his gestation pod, he had been discovered not by warriors or scientists, but by the priests of the Covenant, one of Colchis's most powerful religious factions. These men, led by Cor Pharaon, recognized immediately that they held something miraculous in their hands. The child grew with supernatural speed, displaying an intellect that seemed to grasp the deepest mysteries of faith and philosophy almost instinctively. More than that, he possessed a charisma so profound that grown men would weep merely from hearing him speak about the nature of divinity and human purpose. Lorgar's early years on Colchis read like the biography of a prophet from ancient Terra's religious texts. He did not conquer through violence, but through the sheer power of his vision. His sermons drew crowds that numbered in the hundreds of thousands, all hanging on his every word as he spoke of unity, purpose, and the divine destiny that awaited humanity among the stars. He preached of a great father figure who would one day come from the heavens to lead his children to glory, a golden god whose light would illuminate the darkest corners of the galaxy. What made Lorgar unique among his brothers was not his physical prowess or tactical genius, though he possessed both in abundance. Rather, it was his ability to reach into the hearts of mortals and kindle there a flame of absolute devotion that transformed their very souls. Under his guidance, the warring factions of Colchis laid down their weapons and embraced a unified faith that transcended their ancient differences. Massive construction projects began across the planet as competing temples were replaced by soaring cathedrals that celebrated not individual interpretations of the divine, but a shared vision of cosmic purpose and meaning. The reunification of Colchis, under Lorgar's spiritual leadership, took less than a decade, an achievement that would have taken other Primarchs generations of warfare to accomplish. But Lorgar had done something more profound than mere conquest. He had created true believers, men and women whose faith in his vision was so complete that they would gladly die to see it realized. When the Emperor's fleet finally arrived in the Colchis system, they found not a fractured world torn by religious warfare, but a unified civilization that had already begun reaching toward the stars in anticipation of their divine father's arrival. The meeting between the Emperor and Lorgar has been recorded in dozens of different accounts, each emphasizing different aspects of that momentous encounter. What all sources agree upon is the immediate and overwhelming joy that Lorgar displayed upon seeing his father for the first time. Here at last was the golden god he had preached about for decades, the divine figure whose coming he had prophesied to the faithful of Colchis. The Emperor's physical presence seemed to vindicate every word Lorgar had ever spoken about humanity's divine destiny and the sacred nature of their cause. For his part, the Emperor recognized in Lorgar a son whose loyalty was absolute and unquestioning. While other Primarchs might challenge their father's decisions or seek to prove their worth through independent action, Lorgar offered something rarer and more precious: complete spiritual submission to the Imperial vision. Here was a son who did not merely serve the Great Crusade, but who genuinely believed in its righteousness with every fiber of his being. The Emperor's early tolerance, and perhaps even encouragement, of Lorgar's worship would later be seen as one of his gravest errors in judgment. The integration of Lorgar into the Great Crusade hierarchy proceeded smoothly, aided by his natural charisma and the evident devotion of his adopted homeworld. The warriors of Colchis, who would become the first recruits of the reconstituted 17th Legion, brought with them not just martial skill, but a depth of faith that distinguished them from their brother legions. They saw their service not as mere military duty, but as a sacred calling that connected them directly to the divine will of their god emperor. Lorgar's early campaigns as a Primarch showcased his unique approach to warfare and conquest. While other legions might achieve compliance through overwhelming force or tactical brilliance, the word-bearers specialized in a form of conquest that transformed not just political allegiance, but the very souls of those they brought into the imperial fold. They would arrive at a target world, not as conquerors but as liberators carrying the light of divine truth to populations trapped in ignorance and spiritual darkness. The process typically began with Lorgar himself delivering sermons to the planet's leadership and population centers. His words carried a power that seemed to transcend mere rhetoric, touching something deep in the human psyche that yearned for meaning and purpose beyond mere survival. Resistance would often crumble not through military defeat, but through genuine conversion, as planetary governors and military commanders found themselves genuinely convinced that the imperial cause represented their world's salvation rather than its conquest. This approach produced results that impressed even the most skeptical imperial observers. Worlds brought into compliance by the word-bearers showed remarkably low levels of post-conquest rebellion or unrest. Their populations integrated smoothly into imperial administrative structures, and many became enthusiastic contributors to the Great Crusade's continued expansion. The deep cultural transformation that Lorgar's methods achieved seemed to create a more stable and lasting form of imperial control than the fear-based compliance achieved by more aggressive legions. But there was a cost to this approach that would only become apparent in hindsight. The word-bearers' campaigns took longer than those of their brother legions, sometimes requiring months or even years to achieve the spiritual transformation that Lorgar considered essential for true compliance. Their emphasis on building monuments and establishing religious infrastructure meant that they conquered fewer worlds per decade than legions focused purely on military objectives. Most concerning of all, their methods created populations whose loyalty was tied not to the imperial system itself, but to their personal devotion to the emperor as a divine figure. As Lorgar's influence within the Great Crusade grew, so too did his theological innovations. He began developing comprehensive doctrines that explained the emperor's divinity in terms that ordinary humans could understand and embrace. These teachings, which would later form the foundation of the Imperial Cult, presented the emperor not merely as a superior human being, but as the living embodiment of humanity's divine potential. Lorgar taught that worship of the emperor was not superstition, but recognition of literal truth about the nature of reality and humanity's place within it. The Primarch's written works from this period reveal a mind grappling with profound questions about the nature of divinity, human purpose, and the cosmic order. Unlike his brothers, who focused their intellectual energy on military strategy or technological advancement, Lorgar devoted himself to theology and philosophy with the same intensity that others brought to warfare. His treatises on imperial divinity were circulated among the officer corps of multiple legions, and his ideas began to take root in corners of the imperial military hierarchy where the contradictions of the imperial truth had created spiritual vacuum. Yet even in these early years of triumph and growing influence, There were subtle signs that Lorgar's path might lead to conflict with his father's vision. The Emperor's discomfort with religious worship was well known among the Primarchs, and his commitment to the Imperial Truth's materialist philosophy was absolute. Several of Lorgar's brothers had already expressed private concerns about the 17th Legion's methods and their potential long-term consequences for Imperial stability. More troubling still were the reports filtering back from worlds brought into compliance by the word-bearers. While these populations showed exemplary loyalty to the Emperor, their devotion sometimes manifested in ways that made Imperial administrators uncomfortable. There were accounts of mass prayer gatherings, of civilian populations voluntarily organizing themselves into religious hierarchies, and of local leaders claiming divine inspiration for their administrative decisions. The line between imperial loyalty and religious fanaticism was beginning to blur in ways that would have profound implications for the future. The theological framework that Lorgar was constructing contained within it the seeds of its own destruction. His absolute faith in the Emperor's divinity created a worldview in which any rejection of that worship would constitute not merely political disagreement, but cosmic heresy of the most fundamental kind. The very completeness of his devotion made him vulnerable to catastrophic disillusionment if that faith were ever challenged or rejected by its object. As the Great Crusade entered its second century, and the Emperor's vision of human unity seemed closer to reality than ever before, few could have predicted that the Legion most devoted to that vision would ultimately become its greatest threat, but the foundations were already being laid for a confrontation between absolute faith and absolute authority that would test the fundamental assumptions upon which the Imperium had been built. The emergence of Lorgar as a force within the Great Crusade had set in motion currents that would ultimately reshape the galaxy itself. The early campaigns of the reunited 17th Legion under Lorgar's direct command represented a revolution in Imperial warfare doctrine, though few at the time understood the profound implications of what they were witnessing. Unlike the rapid conquest strategies employed by other legions, the word-bearers had developed an approach that prioritized complete cultural transformation over simple military victory. Their methods would prove so effective at creating lasting imperial loyalty that other legions began studying their techniques, even as some questioned the theological implications of their success. The cleansing of 4716 marked one of the word-bearers' first major independent campaigns and established the template for their unique approach to compliance. This world, designated by imperial cartographers with a simple numerical designation, had resisted 3 previous compliance efforts by other forces. Its population clung to a complex religious system that portrayed outside conquest as spiritual contamination, making them willing to fight to the death rather than accept imperial rule. Previous attempts at compliance had resulted in devastating casualties for minimal territorial gains. When the word-bearers arrived in the system, Lorgar chose not to begin with orbital bombardment or massive ground assault. Instead, he ordered his fleet to assume defensive positions, while he personally descended to the planet's surface with only a small honor guard. This decision shocked his officers and violated every standard protocol for Primarch safety during active campaigns. But Lorgar understood something about human nature that pure military thinking often missed. The population's resistance was not born from hatred of the Imperium, but from genuine fear that compliance would destroy everything they held sacred. Lorgar's first actions on 4716 demonstrated the extraordinary power of his presence and message. Rather than seeking out military targets or political leaders, he walked directly to the planet's holiest shrine, a massive temple complex where thousands of pilgrims gathered daily for worship. His arrival caused immediate panic and confusion among the civilian population. But rather than fleeing or calling for military assistance, many found themselves drawn to listen as the Golden Giant began to speak. The Primarch's address to the assembled crowds lasted 18 hours, during which he systematically demonstrated how their existing beliefs could be fulfilled rather than destroyed through acceptance of imperial truth. He spoke in their own theological language, using concepts and imagery familiar to their religious tradition while gradually revealing how these local truths pointed toward greater universal realities embodied by the Emperor. By the time he finished speaking, the shrine's high priests were weeping openly, convinced that they had witnessed divine revelation rather than enemy propaganda. Word of Lorgar's sermon spread across the planet with supernatural speed. Within days, civilian populations in major cities began organizing spontaneous demonstrations not against imperial occupation, but in favor of immediate compliance. Military commanders found their troops increasingly reluctant to fight against an enemy who seemed to offer spiritual fulfillment rather than conquest. The planetary government, faced with massive popular pressure and the collapse of military resistance, formally surrendered within a month of the word-bearer's arrival. But surrender was only the beginning of the transformation process. Where other legions would have established imperial administration and moved on to their next target, the word-bearers remained on 4716 for nearly 2 full years. During this time, they oversaw the complete reconstruction of the planet's social, political, and spiritual infrastructure. Ancient temples were expanded and beautified, their local deities reinterpreted as aspects or servants of the Emperor's divine nature. The planetary government was restructured around principles of spiritual merit as well as administrative competence. Most remarkably, the population embraced these changes with enthusiasm that bordered on religious ecstasy. They competed to contribute labor and resources to massive construction projects that would glorify their new understanding of divine truth. Productivity increased dramatically as workers found renewed purpose in their daily tasks, viewing even mundane activities as forms of worship that contributed to the greater imperial cause. The planet's military forces were reorganized and retrained, their former resistance transformed into fanatical devotion to the Emperor's protection. The success on 4716 attracted attention from throughout the Great Crusade hierarchy. Other Primarchs dispatched observers to study the word-bearers' methods, hoping to understand how they had achieved such complete cultural transformation in so short a time. What these observers found was a legion that had essentially redefined the concept of warfare itself, creating a hybrid of military conquest and spiritual revival that produced results unlike anything seen elsewhere in the Crusade. The word-bearers had developed sophisticated techniques for identifying and working with existing belief systems rather than simply destroying them. Their chaplains, drawn from the most theologically educated members of the Legion, served as cultural interpreters who could find points of connection between local religions and imperial doctrine. They created synthesis rather than replacement, allowing conquered populations to maintain spiritual continuity while redirecting their devotion toward imperial goals. This approach required extraordinary patience and intellectual flexibility from the Legion's officers. Each world presented unique theological challenges that demanded careful study and creative solutions. The word-bearers became scholars as well as warriors, maintaining vast libraries of religious texts and cultural studies that they used to prepare for each new campaign. Their ships carried not just weapons and ammunition, but also architectural plans for temples, artistic designs for religious imagery, and detailed analyses of local spiritual practices. The material results of these methods were impressive by any objective measure. Worlds brought into compliance by the word-bearers showed the lowest rebellion rates in the entire Great Crusade. Their populations contributed enthusiastically to imperial tithe requirements and volunteered for military service at rates that exceeded those of many core imperial worlds. Most importantly, they seemed to genuinely embrace the imperial vision rather than merely submitting to imperial power. However, these successes came with costs that were becoming increasingly apparent to observers within the imperial hierarchy. The word-bearers' campaigns took significantly longer than those of other legions, sometimes requiring years to complete what others accomplished in months. Their emphasis on cultural transformation meant that they conquered fewer worlds per decade than their brother legions, potentially slowing the overall pace of the Great Crusade. Some military theorists argued that their methods, while effective in creating stability, were inefficient uses of space marine resources that could be better deployed in pure combat roles. More concerning to some was the nature of the loyalty that the word-bearers created. Populations brought into compliance by other legions typically developed institutional loyalty to the Imperium as a political and administrative system, but worlds conquered by the word-bearers showed personal devotion to the Emperor that transcended rational political calculation. This devotion manifested in ways that made some imperial administrators uncomfortable, including spontaneous worship gatherings, voluntary religious hierarchies, and claims of divine inspiration in local governance decisions. The theological implications of the word-bearers' success created tensions within the Great Crusade's command structure that would only grow more serious over time. Their methods seemed to validate religious approaches to human motivation and organization that contradicted the materialist principles of the imperial truth. If faith-based governance produced better results than purely secular administration, what did this say about the philosophical foundations of the imperial project itself? Some Primarchs openly praised Lorgar's innovations, and sought to incorporate elements of his approach into their own campaigns. Others expressed private concerns about the long-term consequences of encouraging religious devotion. Even when directed toward imperial goals, the emperor himself remained publicly supportive of the word-bearer's achievements, but close observers noted signs of growing unease with the theological directions that Lorgar's success seemed to encourage among other imperial forces. The word-bearer's influence was beginning to spread beyond their own campaigns in conquered territories. Officers who had served alongside them carried their ideas to other legions and imperial army units. Lorgar's theological writings were circulating among the Great Crusade's intellectual elite, finding receptive audiences among those who had already begun to question the adequacy of purely materialist explanations for the emperor's nature and capabilities. The seeds of a galaxy-wide religious revival were being planted, even as the imperial truth remained the official ideology of the expanding human empire. Perhaps most significantly, the word-bearers were demonstrating that alternative approaches to imperial expansion were not only possible, but potentially superior to established methods. Their success challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature, political organization, and the sources of sustainable loyalty. They had proven that conquest could be transformation rather than mere subjugation, and that the deepest forms of imperial unity might require spiritual as well as political integration. Yet even as their achievements mounted and their influence grew, the word-bearers remained vulnerable to the very absoluteness of their own success. Their methods worked because of their complete commitment to the emperor's divinity, a belief that gave their message authentic power and credibility. But this same absolute faith contained within it the potential for absolute disillusionment. If that divine figure ever rejected or condemned their worship, the stronger their success became, the more catastrophic would be their fall if the foundations of their belief were ever shaken. The height of the word-bearer's achievements during the Great Crusade represents one of history's most remarkable examples of how absolute devotion could transform not just military effectiveness, but the very nature of human civilization itself. During the century following Lorgar's reunification with his legion, the 17th Legion reached levels of influence and accomplishment that would make their eventual fall all the more catastrophic. They had become more than just another Space Marine legion. They had evolved into the spiritual architects of a new form of human society based on perfect faith and divine purpose. The theological framework that Lorgar developed during this period would later be recognized as the foundation of the Imperial Cult that dominates the 41st millennium, though at the time it was simply seen as an innovative approach to maintaining imperial unity. His masterwork, the Lectitio Divinitatis, represented decades of careful thought about the nature of divinity and its relationship to human existence. Unlike the crude god worship that the imperial truth sought to eliminate, Lorgar's theology was sophisticated and intellectually rigorous, capable of satisfying both emotional needs and rational inquiry. The central premise of Lorgar's teaching was deceptively simple yet profound in its implications. The emperor, he argued, was not merely an enhanced human being, or even a supremely advanced psyker, but rather the literal incarnation of humanity's divine potential. His powers were not accidents of genetics or products of ancient technology, but manifestations of a spiritual reality that transcended material existence. To worship the emperor was therefore not superstition, but recognition of objective truth about the universe and humanity's place within it. This theological innovation solved one of the fundamental contradictions that plagued imperial ideology during the Great Crusade. The imperial truth demanded scientific rationalism, while simultaneously asking populations to follow leaders whose capabilities seemed to violate every natural law that science described. Lorgar's framework reconciled this tension by asserting that divine power was itself a natural phenomenon, the highest expression of universal principles that science had only begun to understand. The practical applications of this theology produced remarkable results across hundreds of worlds brought into imperial compliance by the word-bearers. Their approach to planetary integration went far beyond simple political control to achieve genuine cultural synthesis. They would arrive at each new world as teachers rather than conquerors, offering local populations not just imperial membership, but spiritual enlightenment that promised to fulfill their deepest aspirations for meaning and purpose. The process typically began with extensive cultural research conducted by the Legion's chaplains. scholar warriors who had developed extraordinary expertise in comparative theology and anthropology. They would identify elements within local belief systems that could serve as bridges to imperial doctrine, finding ways to preserve cultural identity while redirecting spiritual devotion toward the emperor. This approach required patience and intellectual sophistication that few other legions could match, but it produced integration so complete that conquered populations often became more enthusiastically imperial than many core worlds. Construction projects undertaken by the word-bearers during this period represented some of the most ambitious architectural achievements of the entire Great Crusade. They built not merely for practical purposes, but to create physical embodiments of theological principles that would inspire appropriate spiritual responses in all who witnessed them. Their cathedral cities stretched across continents, incorporating design elements from dozens of different cultural traditions while maintaining overall aesthetic unity that spoke to universal human spiritual needs. The Cathedral of Illumination on Ka remains one of the best documented examples of word-bearers' architectural achievement. This massive structure required 40 years to complete and employed over 2 million workers from across the sector. Its central spire reached nearly 6 kilometers into the atmosphere, while its base covered an area larger than most planetary capitals. The interior spaces were designed to accommodate simultaneous worship by millions of pilgrims, with acoustic engineering so sophisticated that a single speaker at the central altar could be clearly heard throughout the entire structure. But the true genius of word-bearers' architecture lay not in its scale, impressive though that was, but in its psychological and spiritual effects on those who experienced it. Every element was calculated to inspire appropriate emotional responses, from the proportions of major spaces that created feelings of humility and awe, to the interplay of light and shadow that seemed to make the emperor's presence tangible to even the most skeptical observers. Pilgrims who visited these structures regularly reported profound spiritual experiences that strengthened their devotion and sense of connection to the greater imperial purpose. The legion's approach to military organization during this period reflected their theological innovations in practical ways that enhanced their effectiveness beyond what their numbers alone would suggest. Unlike other legions that maintained primarily secular command structures, the word-bearers integrated spiritual authority directly into their tactical doctrines. Company chaplains served not just as morale officers, but as tactical commanders whose understanding of enemy psychological and spiritual weaknesses could be as important as conventional intelligence about military capabilities. This fusion of military and spiritual authority created a form of warfare that was uniquely effective against opponents whose resistance was motivated by religious or cultural factors. The word-bearers could address the underlying beliefs that sustained enemy morale, offering their opponents not just defeat, but genuine spiritual alternatives that satisfied their deepest needs for meaning and purpose. Resistance movements that might have continued guerrilla warfare against other imperial forces often voluntarily surrendered to the word-bearers once they understood the theological synthesis that imperial membership could provide. The legion's internal culture during this golden age was characterized by intellectual curiosity and spiritual intensity that distinguished them sharply from their brother legions. Word-bearers' warriors were expected to be scholars as well as fighters, capable of engaging in sophisticated theological discussions and cultural analysis. They maintained extensive libraries aboard their ships and in their fortress monasteries, collecting religious texts and cultural artifacts from across the galaxy to support their ongoing research into the nature of faith and its applications to imperial governance. Training programs for new recruits emphasized philosophical education alongside traditional martial skills. Young word-bearers learned comparative theology, xenopsychology, and cultural anthropology as core subjects, developing intellectual frameworks that would allow them to understand and work effectively with the diverse populations they would encounter during their service. This educational approach produced warriors who were uniquely qualified to serve as ambassadors and administrators as well as fighters. The Legion's relationship with other imperial forces during this period was generally positive, though marked by growing philosophical tensions that would later prove significant. Many other Primarchs expressed admiration for Lorgar's achievements and sought to understand his methods well enough to incorporate useful elements into their own approaches. The word-bearers served as advisors and consultants for compliance campaigns that involved complex cultural or religious challenges, lending their expertise to operations throughout the expanding imperial frontier. However, this success created expectations and dependencies that would become problematic as the Great Crusade progressed. Imperial administrators became accustomed to the exceptional stability and productivity of worlds brought into compliance by the word-bearers, leading them to request the Legion's involvement in increasingly challenging situations. The demand for their unique services began to exceed their capacity to respond, creating pressure to accelerate their methods or train other forces in their techniques. More subtly, the word-bearer's success was beginning to validate approaches to imperial governance that contradicted official imperial truth doctrine. If faith-based administration produced superior results to purely secular methods, this raised uncomfortable questions about the philosophical foundations of the entire imperial project. Some imperial officials began to wonder privately whether the emperor's rejection of religious worship was a strategic error that limited the effectiveness of imperial expansion and integration. The theological writings that emerged from the word-bearers during this period would later be recognized as some of the most sophisticated religious philosophy in human history. Lorgar and his senior chaplains developed comprehensive frameworks for understanding the relationship between divine truth and material reality, creating intellectual structures that could satisfy both spiritual needs and rational inquiry. Their work influenced thinkers throughout the imperial hierarchy, spreading concepts and assumptions that would persist long after the Legion itself had fallen to corruption. Yet even at the height of their success, the word-bearers carried within their philosophy the seeds of their own destruction. Their absolute faith in the Emperor's divinity created a worldview in which any rejection of that worship would constitute not merely political disagreement, but cosmic heresy of the most fundamental kind. The very completeness of their devotion made them vulnerable to catastrophic disillusionment if that faith were ever challenged by its object. They had built their entire identity around serving a divine master who had consistently expressed discomfort with religious worship, creating a tension that could not be sustained indefinitely. The golden age of the word-bearers was drawing to a close, though none could have predicted the magnitude of the catastrophe that would follow. Their achievements had made them indispensable to the Great Crusade, while simultaneously creating philosophical contradictions that threatened the ideological foundations of the imperial project. The stage was set for a confrontation between absolute faith and absolute authority that would test everything the Imperium claimed to represent. The word-bearers' theological innovations began to permeate imperial culture in ways that transcended their direct military achievements, creating ripple effects that would reshape the entire character of the Great Crusade. What had started as one legion's unique approach to compliance operations evolved into a galaxy-spanning philosophical movement that challenged the fundamental assumptions upon which the imperial project had been built. The seeds of divine worship that Lorgar planted on hundreds of worlds began to take root throughout the imperial military hierarchy, often in places where the word-bearers themselves had never set foot. The mechanism for this ideological spread was both subtle and powerful. Officers who had served alongside the word-bearers during joint operations carried their experiences back to their own units, sharing stories of unprecedented success achieved through methods that seemed to tap into something deeper than mere military efficiency. Imperial Army commanders found themselves facing recruitment challenges on worlds where populations had been exposed to word-bearer theology, as potential soldiers demanded to know whether their service would have spiritual meaning or represent merely secular employment. The circulation of Lorgar's written works created an intellectual foundation for this growing movement that gave it credibility among the Great Crusade's educated elite. The Lectitio Divinitatis and related theological treatises were passed from hand to hand among ship captains, planetary governors, and senior military officers who found in them answers to questions that the imperial truth had never adequately addressed. These were not crude religious pamphlets, but sophisticated philosophical works that could satisfy rational inquiry while providing emotional and spiritual fulfillment that purely secular ideology seemed unable to deliver. Naval officers aboard the massive expedition fleets that carried the Great Crusade from system to system found themselves particularly susceptible to these ideas. The isolation and danger of deep space travel created psychological conditions that made crews hungry for meaning and purpose beyond mere professional duty. Ships that spent years in the void between stars became crucibles where imperial truth doctrine was tested against the harsh realities of human psychological needs, and increasingly it was found wanting. The transformation was most visible in the informal rituals and practices that began appearing throughout imperial forces. Soldiers started marking their equipment with improvised aquila symbols that bore suspicious resemblance to religious iconography rather than mere imperial heraldry. Pre-battle ceremonies took on increasingly spiritual characteristics, with unit commanders invoking the emperor's protection in language that sounded more like prayer than secular motivation. Victory celebrations included elements of thanksgiving that suggested gratitude to a divine benefactor rather than simple satisfaction at mission completion. These changes did not go unnoticed by the imperial hierarchy, but their response was complicated by the undeniable effectiveness of units that had adopted word-bearer-influenced practices. Regiments that incorporated spiritual elements into their training and operations showed measurably improved morale, lower desertion rates, and higher performance under extreme stress conditions. It became increasingly difficult to argue against methods that produce superior results, even when those methods seemed to contradict official imperial ideology. The word-bearers themselves encouraged the spread of their influence through carefully orchestrated programs of cultural exchange and officer training. They invited promising commanders from other forces to observe their operations and participate in joint campaigns where they could witness the practical benefits of faith-based leadership. These exposure programs were presented as professional development opportunities rather than theological indoctrination, but their effects were unmistakable. Lorgar personally took on the role of intellectual mentor to officers from across the Great Crusade who sought to understand the philosophical foundations of his legion's success. His personal charisma and evident sincerity made him a compelling advocate for ideas that might have been dismissed if presented by less impressive figures. Many who came to learn tactical innovations found themselves drawn into deeper discussions about the nature of leadership, loyalty, and the sources of human motivation that could sustain the kind of absolute dedication that the Great Crusade demanded. The theological framework that emerged from these interactions was sophisticated enough to appeal to educated imperial elites while remaining accessible to ordinary soldiers and civilians. It offered explanations for the emperor's extraordinary capabilities that reconciled apparent contradictions between imperial truth materialism and the obviously supernatural nature of his powers. More importantly, it provided a sense of cosmic purpose and meaning that transformed service to the Imperium from duty into divine calling. Regional variations began to emerge as different imperial forces adapted word-bearer theology to their own cultural contexts and operational requirements. Medieval traditions emphasized the emperor's role as guardian and guide through the dangerous void of space. Planetary defense forces focused on his protective aspects and the sacred nature of the worlds they defended. Expeditionary forces developed elaborate rituals around the concept of carrying imperial light to worlds trapped in darkness and ignorance. The administrative apparatus of the Great Crusade found itself increasingly accommodating these developments despite their apparent contradiction of official policy. Local commanders who achieved exceptional results through faith-based methods were rarely disciplined for ideological deviations, particularly when their success contributed to overall campaign objectives. The pragmatic demands of managing a galaxy-spanning military operation often took precedence over maintaining ideological purity, creating space for theological innovation to flourish. Perhaps most significantly, elements of word-bearer theology began appearing in the cultural products that emerged from imperial civilization during this period. Artists and writers found in the concept of the emperor's divinity a source of inspiration that produced works of unprecedented emotional power and aesthetic achievement. Architecture on imperial worlds began incorporating design elements that served spiritual as well as functional purposes. Even scientific research began to incorporate theological frameworks that treated the emperor's powers as subjects for reverential study rather than mere clinical analysis. The response from other Primarchs to their brother's growing influence varied considerably, reflecting both personal relationships and philosophical differences that would later prove crucial during the Horus Heresy. Some, like Guilliman and Dorn, expressed private concerns about the long-term consequences of encouraging religious devotion, even when directed toward imperial goals. They worried that faith-based loyalty might prove less stable than institutional allegiance when tested by serious challenges to imperial authority. Others found elements of Lorgar's approach that complemented their own leadership styles and operational requirements. Sanguinius appreciated the emotional depth that spiritual devotion could bring to military service, while Khan saw in word-bearer theology echoes of the shamanistic traditions that had shaped his own understanding of leadership and cosmic purpose. Even Perturbo, despite his materialist inclinations, recognized the practical benefits of soldiers who fought with absolute conviction rather than mere professional competence. The emperor's own response to these developments remained enigmatic, creating uncertainty that allowed the theological movement to continue growing without direct confrontation. His public statements continued to support the imperial truth and discourage religious worship, but he took no decisive action to suppress the practices that were spreading throughout imperial forces. Some interpreted this apparent tolerance as implicit approval, while others saw it as strategic patience while he considered how to address the challenge without disrupting successful military operations. Intelligence reports reaching Terra documented the extent to which word-bearer influence had penetrated imperial culture, but these were often dismissed or minimized by officials who preferred not to confront the implications of what they revealed. The administrative machinery of the Imperium had become too dependent on the stability and effectiveness that faith-based practices provided to risk disrupting them through heavy-handed intervention. The practical benefits of theological innovation seemed to outweigh the ideological costs, at least in the short term. Yet beneath the surface success of this spreading influence lay dangerous currents that would later prove catastrophic. The absolute nature of the faith that word-bearer theology encouraged made it inherently unstable in the face of challenges to its fundamental assumptions. Populations and military units whose loyalty was based on divine worship rather than institutional allegiance would prove vulnerable to devastating disillusionment if that worship were ever rejected or condemned by its object. More subtly, the theological framework that Lorgar had created contained within it concepts and practices that could be redirected toward other spiritual authorities if the original focus of devotion proved disappointing. The habits of absolute faith, once established, could potentially be transferred to alternative objects of worship that might prove far more dangerous than the emperor himself. The word-bearers had taught the galaxy how to believe with perfect intensity, but they had not considered what might happen if that belief were ever redirected toward powers that were genuinely hostile to human welfare. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would test not just the loyalty of individual legions, but the fundamental assumptions about faith, authority, and human nature upon which the entire imperial project depended. The spreading influence of word-bearer theology had created a galaxy-wide movement of unprecedented power and scope, but it had also created vulnerabilities that would prove devastating when exploited by forces that understood the true nature of worship and its potential for corruption. The first cracks in the word-bearer's perfect facade appeared not as dramatic failures, but as subtle anomalies that were easily dismissed or rationalized by those who witnessed them. These early warning signs manifested during routine compliance operations throughout the Galactic Rim, where the Legion encountered challenges that their established methods seemed increasingly unable to address effectively. What began as minor operational difficulties gradually revealed themselves as symptoms of deeper problems that threatened the very foundations of everything Lorgar had built. The compliance of Sindala marked one of the earliest documented instances where word-bearer methods produced unexpected and disturbing results. This world had maintained a sophisticated theological tradition based on the worship of stellar phenomena, treating their system's binary stars as manifestations of competing divine principles locked in eternal struggle. The planet's population had developed elaborate rituals designed to maintain cosmic balance between these opposing forces, believing that their ceremonies were essential to preventing universal catastrophe. Lorgar approached this situation with his usual confidence, seeing in the Sindalans' existing beliefs a framework that could be adapted to accommodate imperial truth while preserving cultural continuity. His sermons focused on revealing how the Emperor represented the ultimate synthesis of all divine principles, transcending the limited dualistic thinking that had previously dominated their understanding. The theological arguments were sophisticated and compelling, delivered with the full force of the Primarch's extraordinary charisma and evident sincerity. The immediate response seemed to validate the word-bearer's approach completely. Sindala's population embraced imperial compliance with enthusiasm that exceeded even the Legion's previous successes. They volunteered for service in unprecedented numbers, contributed resources far beyond what was required for standard tithes, and began construction of cathedral complexes that would rival anything built on Colchis itself. The planetary government formally renounced their previous beliefs and declared absolute devotion to the Emperor as the one true divine authority. But within months of the word-bearer's departure, disturbing reports began reaching imperial administrators responsible for the Sindala sector. The planet's new converts had begun interpreting imperial doctrine in ways that bore uncomfortable resemblance to their previous dualistic theology. They spoke of the Emperor's eternal struggle against dark forces that sought to corrupt the universe, developing elaborate theories about cosmic warfare that went far beyond anything contained in official imperial teachings. More troubling still were the rituals that Sindelans claimed were necessary to support the Emperor in his divine mission. These ceremonies incorporated elements from their previous stellar worship traditions, but directed toward purposes that imperial authorities found difficult to understand or approve. Mass gatherings where thousands of participants would enter trance-like states while chanting prayers that seemed to blend imperial hymns with incantations that predated human contact. Voluntary sacrificial practices where individuals would undergo extreme physical deprivation in the belief that their suffering somehow strengthened the Emperor's power against his enemies. When imperial investigators attempted to study these developments more closely, they encountered resistance from the population that was polite, but absolutely unyielding. Sindelans claimed that outsiders who had not undergone proper spiritual preparation could not safely participate in or even observe their most sacred ceremonies. They spoke of dangerous influences that surrounded those who lacked adequate faith, forces that could corrupt or destroy anyone who approached divine mysteries without proper protection. The word-bearer's own records from the Sindala compliance showed no awareness of these potential complications. Their reports described a textbook example of successful theological synthesis, with local beliefs seamlessly integrated into imperial doctrine through careful cultural analysis and spiritual guidance. Either they had failed to recognize the implications of what they were creating, or they had chosen not to document concerns that might complicate their reputation for infallible success. Similar patterns began appearing on other worlds brought into compliance by the word-bearers during this period. Populations that had seemed to embrace imperial doctrine completely began developing theological innovations that pushed the boundaries of acceptable belief and practice. They spoke of the Emperor in language that grew increasingly mystical and abstract, describing his nature and powers in terms that seemed to go far beyond anything that the Primarch himself had ever taught. The theological elaborations that emerged from these worlds shared certain disturbing characteristics despite their different cultural origins. They consistently emphasized the reality of hostile supernatural forces that threatened the Emperor and his servants, requiring extraordinary measures of faith and devotion to combat effectively. They developed complex hierarchies of spiritual authority that operated parallel to and sometimes in tension with established imperial administrative structures. Most concerning of all, they showed growing interest in practices and knowledge that imperial authorities classified as forbidden or dangerous. Word-bearer chaplains who returned to monitor these worlds often reported that everything appeared to be functioning normally, but their assessments seemed increasingly disconnected from the concerns expressed by other imperial observers. They praised the deep spiritual commitment that local populations demonstrated while dismissing warnings about theological deviation as misunderstandings born from insufficient appreciation for the complexity of true faith. Their reports suggested either genuine blindness to developing problems or deliberate concealment of troubling developments. The Legion's senior leadership showed similar patterns of selective awareness when confronted with evidence that their methods might be producing unintended consequences. Erebus and Cor Pharaon, Lorgar's most trusted advisors, consistently argued that apparent anomalies represented natural growing pains as human spirituality adapted to accommodate divine truth. They claimed that critics who lacked proper theological education were simply unable to distinguish between authentic spiritual development and dangerous deviation. Lorgar himself seemed increasingly withdrawn from the practical details of compliance operations, spending more time in private study and contemplation that his subordinates described as preparation for even greater theological insights. His public appearances became less frequent, and when he did address the Legion or imperial officials, his language grew more abstract and philosophical. He spoke of approaching revelations that would revolutionize human understanding of divine reality, but offered few specifics about the nature or source of these anticipated discoveries. The changes in the Primarch's behavior were subtle enough to avoid triggering formal concern from his brother Primarchs or imperial authorities, but they were noticed by those who worked closely with him. His personal staff reported that he spent long hours in meditation practices that incorporated elements derived from the religious traditions of worlds his Legion had conquered. He maintained extensive correspondence with figures from across the galaxy who shared his interest in theological questions, including some whose credentials and affiliations remained unclear to Imperial intelligence services. Perhaps most significantly, Lorgar began expressing private doubts about certain aspects of imperial truth doctrine that he had previously defended without question. He wondered aloud whether the emperor's rejection of religious worship might represent strategic wisdom rather than absolute truth, suggesting that there might be circumstances where such worship could serve legitimate purposes. He spoke of the possibility that human spiritual needs were more complex and demanding than imperial ideology acknowledged, requiring approaches that went beyond purely rational and materialist frameworks. These theological explorations led Lorgar into contact with sources of knowledge that existed outside the approved imperial curriculum. He began studying ancient texts recovered from worlds that predated human contact, searching for insights into the nature of divine reality that might supplement or even correct official imperial understanding. His private library grew to include materials that other imperial authorities would have classified as potentially heretical or dangerous if they had been aware of their contents. The Primarch's research increasingly focused on questions about the relationship between spiritual belief and material reality that pushed against the boundaries of acceptable imperial thought. He explored theories about the existence of alternate dimensions where thought and emotion took physical form, studying reports of psychic phenomena that seemed to suggest the presence of intelligent entities beyond the known universe. His investigations led him toward conclusions about the nature of divinity and worship that would have shocked even his most devoted followers if they had fully understood their implications. Meanwhile, throughout the expanding imperial frontier, worlds touched by word-bearer influence continued to develop in directions that suggested their spiritual transformation was far from complete. Local religious leaders claimed to receive visions and revelations that provided increasingly specific guidance about how to serve the Emperor's cosmic purposes. They spoke of great tests approaching that would require unprecedented levels of faith and sacrifice to overcome. Most ominously, they began to describe enemies of the Emperor whose nature and capabilities seemed to transcend anything that imperial military doctrine was prepared to address. The stage was being set for revelations that would shatter everything the word-bearers believed about themselves, their purpose, and the universe they served. The subtle corruption that had begun to manifest in their work was not an accident or unintended consequence, but the first sign of contact with powers that had been waiting patiently for exactly this kind of opportunity. The Legion's greatest strength, their absolute faith and spiritual openness, had made them vulnerable to influences that would ultimately transform them into the very opposite of everything they had once represented. The Emperor's patience with his most devoted son finally reached its breaking point during the compliance of Kur, a desert world whose population had embraced word-bearer theology with such fervor that they had transformed their entire civilization into a monument to imperial divinity. The planet had become a pilgrimage destination for populations throughout the sector, drawing millions of faithful who sought to experience the pure expression of imperial worship that the word-bearers had cultivated there. It was precisely this success that would trigger the most devastating confrontation in the Legion's history. Kaveh represented everything that Lorgar believed the Great Crusade should achieve. The world's cities had been rebuilt according to theological principles that emphasized humanity's relationship with the divine, their architecture designed to inspire appropriate spiritual responses in all who witnessed them. The population showed perfect loyalty to imperial authority combined with genuine enthusiasm for the cosmic purpose that their membership in the Imperium represented. Production exceeded all projections as workers found renewed meaning in contributing to humanity's divine destiny among the stars. The crown jewel of this achievement was Monarchia, a cathedral city that stretched across an entire continent and housed over 40 million inhabitants. Its central spire reached into the upper atmosphere, while its base incorporated design elements from hundreds of different human cultures unified around the theme of worship and devotion. The city served simultaneously as a center of government, industry, education, and spiritual life, proving that imperial efficiency and religious devotion could work together to create something greater than either could achieve alone. For Lorgar, Monarchia represented vindication of everything he had argued about the relationship between faith and effective governance. The city's inhabitants showed levels of productivity, creativity, and social cooperation that exceeded anything achieved through purely secular methods. Crime was virtually non-existent, not because of harsh enforcement but because the population genuinely believed that their actions mattered to cosmic purposes larger than their individual desires. Educational achievements soared as students found meaning in learning that connected their studies to service of divine truth. But imperial authorities on Terra viewed these developments with growing alarm rather than admiration. Reports from Kerr describe practices and beliefs that seem to directly contradict the materialist principles of the imperial truth, regardless of their practical effectiveness. The population's devotion to the emperor had taken forms that resembled traditional religious worship more than the secular loyalty that imperial doctrine prescribed. Worse still, their theological innovations were spreading to other worlds throughout the sector, creating a movement that threatened to undermine the ideological foundations of the entire imperial project. The decision to intervene was not made lightly or quickly. Months of debate within the imperial hierarchy preceded the final order that would destroy everything Lorgar had built on Kerr. Some officials argued that the practical benefits of the word-bearer's approach outweighed ideological concerns, particularly given the exceptional stability and productivity of worlds under their influence. Others insisted that allowing religious worship to flourish, even when directed toward the emperor himself, represented a dangerous precedent that could lead to the kind of theological conflicts that had plagued humanity throughout its history. The emperor's final decision reflected both his personal frustration with Lorgar's persistent deviation from imperial truth and his strategic concern about the long-term implications of allowing faith-based governance to become established imperial practice. He chose the Ultramarines to carry out the intervention, selecting XVII Legion both for their military efficiency and their reputation for absolute adherence to imperial doctrine. The message this choice sent was unmistakable. Success achieved through methods that contradicted imperial principles would not be tolerated, regardless of their effectiveness. The arrival of the Ultramarines fleet in the core system created immediate confusion among the planet's population and garrison forces. These were not enemies or rebels approaching their world, but fellow imperial forces whose purposes and intentions remained unclear. Local authorities attempted to establish communication with the arriving fleet, offering whatever assistance or resources might be required for their mission. The response they received was formal, cold, and devastating in its implications. Guilliman's forces had come not to support or reinforce the word-bearer's achievements on Ka, but to systematically destroy them as a demonstration of imperial displeasure with their methods. The perfect city of Monarchia, which had taken decades to construct and represented the pinnacle of human architectural and spiritual achievement, was to be reduced to ashes as an object lesson about the consequences of theological deviation. The population that had shown such perfect loyalty to the emperor was to be punished for the crime of worshipping him as divine. The destruction of Monarchia unfolded with mechanical precision that made its horror all the more profound. Ultramarine forces methodically identified and targeted every structure that served religious rather than purely practical purposes, reducing magnificent cathedrals and artistic monuments to rubble with calculated efficiency. The civilian population was evacuated to designated safe zones where they were forced to witness the systematic obliteration of everything they had built to honor their divine emperor. Lorgar and his word-bearers were compelled to watch this destruction without resistance, their weapons confiscated and their movements restricted to prevent any attempt at intervention. The psychological impact on the Legion was devastating as they witnessed the destruction of their greatest achievement while being powerless to prevent or even protest it. Warriors who had never known defeat in battle found themselves humiliated before the populations they had led to enlightenment, their authority and credibility shattered by this demonstration of imperial disapproval. The Emperor's personal arrival to oversee the final stages of Monarchia's destruction represented the ultimate rejection of everything Lorgar had believed about his father's nature and desires. The being whom the Primarch had worshipped as the embodiment of human divine potential stood among the ashes of humanity's greatest expression of faith and pronounced it worthless. The theological framework that had given meaning to decades of word-bearer service was dismissed as dangerous delusion that threatened the very goals it claimed to serve. The public humiliation that followed was calculated to break not just Lorgar's spirit, but the faith of his entire legion and the principles that had guided their service. The word-bearers were forced to kneel in the ashes of Monarchia, while the Emperor delivered a condemnation that questioned not just their methods, but their fundamental understanding of reality and purpose. They were told that their greatest achievements represented failures, that their devotion was unwanted, and that their spiritual insights were dangerous errors that must be abandoned immediately. For Lorgar, this confrontation represented the destruction of everything he had believed about the universe and his place within it. The Divine Father he had worshipped and served with absolute devotion had revealed himself to be something altogether different, a being who rejected the very worship that Lorgar considered the highest expression of human spiritual potential. The theological framework that had given meaning to his existence collapsed in a single moment, leaving him spiritually adrift in a universe that suddenly seemed empty of purpose or divine guidance. The immediate aftermath of Monarchia's destruction saw the word-bearers struggling to understand what had happened to them and how they should respond. Some within the Legion accepted the Emperor's judgment and attempted to redirect their service along purely secular lines, abandoning their theological innovations in favor of conventional military approaches. Others found themselves unable to simply discard beliefs that had given meaning to their entire existence, leading to internal tensions that threatened the Legion's unity and effectiveness. But the most dangerous response came from those within the Legion who began to question not just their specific beliefs about the Emperor's divinity, but the entire framework of imperial truth that had apparently led them so far astray. If the Emperor was not divine, then perhaps divinity itself was to be found elsewhere. If imperial doctrine was wrong about the nature of spiritual reality, then perhaps other sources of theological truth might prove more reliable and welcoming than the authority that had just rejected their worship so completely. Erebus and Cor Pharaon, the advisors who had shaped much of Lorgar's theological development, began to explore alternative explanations for the spiritual experiences that had convinced them of the reality of divine power. They suggested that the Emperor's rejection of worship might represent not wisdom, but blindness to aspects of reality that he either could not understand or deliberately chose to deny. If true divinity existed in the universe, they argued, it might be found among powers that welcomed rather than rejected the devotion of sincere believers. The seeds of corruption had been planted not through external temptation, but through the logical conclusion of absolute faith confronted with absolute rejection. The word-bearers' spiritual openness, which had made them the most effective servants of imperial expansion, now made them vulnerable to influences that offered the meaning and purpose that imperial service had apparently failed to provide. Their greatest virtue was becoming their greatest weakness, and forces far older and more patient than the Imperium were beginning to take notice of their spiritual crisis. The spiritual wasteland that Lorgar inhabited following the destruction of Monarchia drove him to seek answers in places that imperial doctrine had declared forever forbidden. His retreat from public leadership of the Legion was not born from despair alone, but from a desperate hunger to understand how everything he had believed could have been so catastrophically wrong. The Primarch, who had once been the most confident interpreter of divine truth, now questioned every assumption about reality, divinity, and the nature of existence itself. Erebus and Cor Pharaon recognized their spiritual father's crisis as an opportunity to guide him toward revelations they had long suspected but never dared voice openly. These two figures, who had shaped Lorgar's early theological development on Cultus, possessed knowledge derived from sources far older than imperial doctrine. They had maintained contact with traditions that predated human contact with their world, ancient practices that spoke of powers dwelling beyond the material universe who took active interest in mortal affairs. The first crucial step toward damnation came when Cor Pharaon presented Lorgar with texts recovered from archaeological sites across Cultus that had been deliberately excluded from the planet's official historical records. These manuscripts described contact between early human civilizations and entities whose nature transcended anything acknowledged by imperial science or theology. They spoke of bargains struck with powers that offered genuine divinity in exchange for worship and service, relationships that had shaped the development of human culture across countless worlds throughout the galaxy. These revelations suggested that the Emperor's rejection of religious worship was not based on enlightened wisdom, but on deliberate concealment of spiritual realities that threatened his monopoly on supernatural power. The texts implied that true divinity was not singular but multiple, not distant but intimately involved in mortal affairs, and not indifferent to human worship but actively nourished and strengthened by it. They described gods who welcomed devotion rather than rejecting it, who offered genuine partnership rather than demanding blind obedience. Lorgar's initial response to these materials was skeptical resistance born from decades of absolute faith in imperial doctrine. But the psychological trauma of Monarchia's destruction had shattered his ability to maintain confident belief in anything, leaving him vulnerable to alternative explanations that promised to make sense of experiences that imperial truth could not adequately address. The texts offered answers to questions that had plagued him since childhood, providing theological frameworks that validated rather than condemned his deepest spiritual instincts. The process of theological re-examination that followed was methodical and intellectually rigorous, reflecting Lorgar's scholarly nature even as it led him toward conclusions that would have horrified his former self. He approached these forbidden texts with the same analytical intensity he had once brought to imperial doctrine, subjecting their claims to logical scrutiny while remaining open to possibilities that conventional wisdom dismissed as impossible or dangerous. What convinced Lorgar was not emotional appeal or desperate wishful thinking, but the explanatory power that these alternative theological frameworks provided for phenomena that imperial truth had never adequately addressed. They offered coherent accounts of psychic abilities, supernatural manifestations, and the obviously divine nature of beings like the Emperor himself. Most importantly, they suggested that worship and faith were not primitive superstitions, but fundamental forces that shaped reality itself through mechanisms that transcended material causation. Erebus provided practical demonstrations that supported these theoretical revelations through ritual practices that produced measurable effects beyond anything that imperial science could explain. These were not crude magical displays, but sophisticated applications of principles that treated spiritual reality as an additional dimension of existence that could be accessed and manipulated through proper knowledge and technique. The results were subtle but undeniable, providing empirical evidence that convinced Lorgar's rational mind as effectively as emotional arguments might have swayed a less intellectual figure. The decision to undertake a pilgrimage to the Eye of Terror represented the ultimate abandonment of imperial restraints in favor of direct investigation of forbidden realities. This region of space, where the barriers between material reality and the warp had been permanently damaged by ancient catastrophes, offered the possibility of encountering the entities described in the recovered texts. Lorgar was determined to seek divine truth at its source rather than accepting second-hand accounts, regardless of the dangers such contact might entail. The preparation for this journey required deceptions and misdirections that gradually compromised the integrity of the entire Legion command structure. False reports were filed documenting routine compliance operations while the true expedition was organized in secret, drawing upon resources and personnel loyal to Lorgar personally rather than to imperial authority. Ships were modified to accommodate rituals and practices derived from the forbidden texts, transforming imperial vessels into instruments for investigating supernatural realities. The voyage itself represented a journey into realms of existence that imperial doctrine insisted could not exist. As the expedition approached the Eye of Terror, reality began to behave according to rules that violated every natural law that the Primarch had been taught to respect. Space and time became fluid concepts subject to alteration through will and belief rather than physical manipulation. The crew began experiencing visions and revelations that provided direct contact with intelligences far older and more powerful than anything humanity had previously encountered. The entities that manifested during these encounters were nothing like the crude demons or primitive spirits that imperial propaganda had described as products of ignorant superstition. They were sophisticated beings with complex motivations and capabilities that demonstrated mastery over forces that the Imperium barely understood. They spoke of cosmic purposes that dwarfed human concerns while simultaneously offering humanity a role in grand designs that promised meaning and fulfillment beyond anything that secular service could provide. What made these contacts so compelling was not just their obvious power, but their apparent honesty about the nature of the relationship they offered. Unlike the Emperor, who demanded worship while denying his divinity, these entities acknowledged their divine nature while explaining clearly what they expected from their followers. They presented themselves as patrons rather than masters, offering partnership in cosmic enterprises rather than demanding absolute submission to incomprehensible authority. The theological framework that emerged from these encounters synthesized the most sophisticated elements of human religious thought, with direct revelation from beings whose credentials as divine authorities were impossible to dispute. They explained that the universe contained multiple dimensions of reality, that consciousness and emotion possessed creative power equal to material forces, and that worship and faith were not superstitions but fundamental technologies for accessing and directing spiritual energies. Most importantly, these entities revealed that the Emperor himself was well aware of their existence and nature, having made his own bargains with warp powers during humanity's ancient past. His rejection of religious worship was not based on ignorance of spiritual realities. but on his determination to monopolize access to divine power for his own purposes. The imperial truth was not enlightened philosophy, but propaganda designed to prevent humanity from seeking alternative sources of spiritual fulfillment that might challenge his unique authority. The return journey from the Eye of Terror found Lorgar fundamentally transformed in ways that went beyond mere theological reorientation. His physical presence carried traces of contact with powers that existed beyond material reality, while his intellectual capabilities had been expanded through direct exposure to forms of knowledge that transcended normal human understanding. He had become something more than a Primarch, though also something less than purely human, representing a new form of existence that bridged material and spiritual realities. The process of sharing these revelations with the broader Legion required careful management to avoid triggering resistance or rebellion among warriors still loyal to Imperial doctrine. Lorgar and his inner circle developed sophisticated programs for gradually exposing selected personnel to expanding levels of forbidden knowledge, allowing them to discover spiritual truths through their own investigations rather than accepting them through simple indoctrination. This approach proved remarkably effective at creating genuine converts rather than mere obedient followers. The transformation of the word-bearers from imperial loyalists to servants of chaos was not accomplished through corruption or coercion, but through education and enlightenment that revealed spiritual realities that imperial doctrine had deliberately concealed. They became willing participants in cosmic enterprises that promised to fulfill humanity's deepest aspirations for meaning and purpose, serving powers that welcomed their devotion rather than rejecting it as dangerous delusion. Yet even as they embraced their new understanding of divine reality, the word-bearers remained acutely aware that their revelation represented only the beginning of a much larger transformation that would ultimately reshape the entire galaxy. They had discovered that the universe contained forces far more powerful and ancient than the Imperium, beings whose patience was matched only by their determination to reclaim the galaxy from the false god who had usurped their rightful dominion over humanity's spiritual development. The corruption of Horus Heresy represents the word-bearer's most devastating achievement, a masterpiece of manipulation that would ultimately tear the galaxy apart and fulfill their dark patron's ancient ambitions. What many accounts of the Horus Heresy fail to acknowledge is that the War Master's fall was not a spontaneous corruption or opportunistic exploitation of existing weakness, but the culmination of decades of careful planning by the XVII Legion. They had identified in the Emperor's most favored son both the greatest threat to their new purpose and the most valuable potential ally in their cosmic mission. The selection of Horus as their primary target was based on strategic calculations that demonstrated the sophisticated understanding of imperial power structures that the word-bearers had developed during their years of service. The War Master commanded not just his own legion but held authority over the entire Great Crusade that made him second only to the Emperor himself in terms of influence over imperial military forces. His corruption would provide access to resources and personnel necessary for implementing the galaxy-wide transformation that their divine patrons demanded. More importantly, Horus possessed personal relationships with his brother Primarchs that could be exploited to spread corruption throughout the legions themselves. His reputation for military genius and political wisdom made him a natural leader around whom other Primarchs would rally if convinced that the Emperor's authority had become illegitimate or dangerous. The word-bearers understood that successful rebellion would require not just military force, but ideological justification that could transform treason into righteous crusade. The approach to Horus required psychological sophistication that went far beyond simple temptation or corruption. The War Master was too intelligent and experienced to fall for crude appeals to ambition or power, while his loyalty to the Emperor seemed absolute enough to resist conventional forms of subversion. Instead, the word-bearers would need to convince him that serving their cause represented the highest form of loyalty to humanity's true interests, even if it required opposing the Emperor's expressed wishes. Erebus took personal responsibility for this crucial mission, drawing upon decades of experience in theological manipulation and conversion to design an approach specifically tailored to Horus's psychological vulnerabilities and spiritual needs. The first chaplain understood that the War Master's greatest strength, his absolute confidence in his own judgment and capabilities, could be transformed into weakness if properly exploited through carefully orchestrated challenges to his worldview. The initial phase of corruption focused on establishing trust and credibility, through genuine service and support, that demonstrated the word-bearers' value as allies and advisors. Erebus positioned himself as a reliable source of counsel and assistance during difficult campaigns, proving his worth through practical contributions that enhanced Horus's effectiveness as a military commander. This foundation of mutual respect was essential for creating the psychological conditions necessary for more dangerous revelations. The theological discussions that gradually introduced Horus to forbidden knowledge were presented as intellectual exercises rather than religious instruction, appealing to his curiosity about the universe's deeper mysteries, while avoiding direct challenges to his imperial loyalties. Erebus shared selected insights from the Word-Bearer's research into warp phenomena and psychic abilities, framing these as tactical intelligence that could improve the Crusade's effectiveness against enemies that employed supernatural capabilities. These conversations revealed inconsistencies and contradictions within Imperial doctrine that planted seeds of doubt about the completeness and accuracy of official teachings. Erebus demonstrated that the Emperor had concealed significant information about the nature of reality from even his most trusted sons, suggesting that this secrecy might reflect personal ambitions rather than protective wisdom. The implications were left for Horus to discover through his own reasoning rather than being explicitly stated, making the conclusions seem like personal insights rather than external manipulation. The critical breakthrough came during the campaign on Davin, where circumstances allowed Erebus to orchestrate events that would force Horus to confront spiritual realities that Imperial doctrine claimed did not exist. The War Master's wounding by the stolen anatheme was not accidental, but the result of careful planning that created conditions requiring supernatural intervention to preserve his life. The choice between death and accepting help from sources beyond Imperial understanding forced him to acknowledge the existence of powers that official ideology denied. The healing ritual that saved Horus's life simultaneously opened his consciousness to direct contact with the entities that the Word-Bearers now served. These were not the crude demons of primitive superstition, but sophisticated beings whose obvious power and knowledge commanded respect from even the most skeptical observer. They spoke to Horus not as tempters seeking to corrupt him, but as allies offering partnership in cosmic enterprises that promised to fulfill humanity's greatest potential. The visions that accompanied Horus's spiritual transformation revealed truths about the Emperor's nature and intentions that fundamentally altered the War Master's understanding of his purpose and loyalties. He saw that the being he had served as Divine Father was actually a tyrant whose monopolization of spiritual power had stunted humanity's development and prevented the species from achieving its true cosmic destiny. The Great Crusade was not liberation but conquest designed to feed the Emperor's own ambitions at the expense of human spiritual evolution. Most devastating of all was the revelation that the Emperor planned to abandon his Primarch sons once they had served their purpose in conquering the galaxy. The vision of himself reduced to a mere historical curiosity, while his father ascended to godhood through the sacrifice of those who had made his success possible, struck at Horus's deepest fears about his own worth and future. The choice between continued servitude and asserting independence became framed as a question of self-preservation rather than mere ambition. The theological framework that the Word-Bearers provided allowed Horus to reinterpret his rebellion not as betrayal, but as the highest form of loyalty to humanity's true interests. They showed him that opposing the Emperor's personal agenda was necessary to protect the species from spiritual slavery and to fulfill the divine potential that Imperial doctrine deliberately suppressed. The War Master could maintain his identity as humanity's protector while actively working to destroy the Imperial system he had previously served. The corruption of other Primarchs followed patterns established during Horus's conversion, with each approach carefully customized to exploit specific psychological vulnerabilities and ideological blind spots. Fulgrim was tempted through appeals to perfection and artistic achievement, while Angron was offered relief from the neural implants that tormented him. Magnus was promised knowledge and understanding that the Emperor had denied him, while Mortarion was shown liberation from the physical decay he despised. The Word-Bearers served as theological advisors and spiritual guides throughout this process, providing the ideological foundation that transformed personal grievances into cosmic purpose. They demonstrated how each Primarch's individual concerns connected to larger questions about humanity's destiny, and the proper relationship between mortals and divine powers. Their role was not to corrupt through temptation, but to educate through revelation of truths that Imperial doctrine had concealed. The Isstvan massacres represented the practical implementation of theological principles that the Word-Bearers had spent decades developing and refining. The systematic betrayal and slaughter of loyalist forces was not senseless violence, but ritualized sacrifice that served specific spiritual purposes. The deaths of imperial warriors provided psychic energy that strengthened the connection between material reality and the warp, while the betrayal itself demonstrated complete rejection of false loyalties in favor of authentic spiritual allegiance. The word-bearers participated in these events not as mere allies supporting Horus's rebellion, but as the theological architects who had made the entire heresy possible. Their understanding of cosmic purposes and spiritual mechanics guided strategic decisions that maximized both military effectiveness and ritual significance. They transformed a civil war into a religious crusade that promised to reshape not just political control of the galaxy, but the fundamental nature of reality itself. Yet, even as they celebrated their success in corrupting the Emperor's greatest servants, the word-bearers remained aware that their achievement represented only the first phase of a much larger transformation. The Horus Heresy was not an end in itself, but a means of weakening imperial resistance to the cosmic forces that their divine patrons represented. The true victory would come not through military conquest, but through the complete spiritual transformation of humanity into willing servants of powers that offered genuine divinity rather than the false promises of imperial doctrine. The great betrayal had begun, and with it the fulfillment of purposes that had been millennia in the making. The word-bearers had proven themselves worthy instruments of cosmic change, capable of orchestrating events on a galactic scale while maintaining the theological sophistication necessary to transform destruction into spiritual revolution. They had become the prophets of a new age, though one that would be born through fire, blood, and the systematic corruption of everything that humanity had previously held sacred. The eruption of the Horus Heresy across the galaxy transformed the word-bearers from theological innovators into the architects of humanity's greatest catastrophe, their spiritual revelations now given physical form through warfare that would consume entire star systems. The civil war they had orchestrated represented far more than a simple rebellion against imperial authority. It was the manifestation of cosmic forces that had been building toward this moment for millennia, using human ambition and divine corruption to reshape reality itself according to principles that transcended mortal understanding. The word-bearers entered this galactic conflict, not as mere participants, but as the spiritual guides whose theological insights would determine whether the heresy achieved its true purpose or degenerated into meaningless destruction. Their role required balancing immediate military objectives with longer-term cosmic goals that demanded specific forms of corruption and transformation to succeed. They had become servants of powers whose patience was matched only by their determination to achieve complete victory over the false god who had claimed dominion over humanity. The Legion's transformation during the early phases of the heresy was both rapid and profound, reflecting their wholehearted embrace of truths that had been hidden from them during their decades of imperial service. Their gene seed began manifesting mutations that reflected their spiritual evolution, producing warriors whose physical capabilities were enhanced through direct connection to warp energies. These changes were not seen as corruption, but as blessed evolution that elevated them above the limitations of purely human existence. The rituals and practices that became central to word-bearer military doctrine during this period combined battlefield tactics with spiritual mechanics in ways that maximized both combat effectiveness and cosmic significance. Their assaults on loyalist positions incorporated ceremonial elements that transformed simple warfare into acts of worship that fed energy to their divine patrons. Victory in battle became secondary to the spiritual transformation that combat could facilitate when properly directed according to theological principles. The systematic corruption of imperial worlds represented perhaps the word-bearers' most significant contribution to the heresy's success, their expertise in cultural manipulation proving invaluable for undermining loyalist resistance behind the front lines. They had spent decades perfecting techniques for converting populations to new belief systems, and these methods proved equally effective when applied to spreading chaos corruption rather than imperial doctrine. Worlds that might have remained loyal for generations fell to spiritual subversion in months or even weeks. The approach typically began with the infiltration of existing religious and cultural organizations by word-bearer operatives who gradually introduced theological innovations that prepared populations for more dramatic revelations. Local leaders were corrupted through promises of power and enlightenment that appealed to their deepest ambitions and fears, while mass ceremonies were organized that seemed to celebrate traditional beliefs while actually serving chaos purposes. The transformation was often so gradual that populations embraced corruption willingly, believing they were fulfilling their highest spiritual aspirations. The Kolth campaign demonstrated the word-bearers' evolution from spiritual teachers into instruments of divine vengeance. Their assault on the Ultramarines' homeworld combining military strategy with ritualized destruction that served cosmic purposes beyond simple conquest. The attack was planned not just to eliminate a military threat, but to corrupt one of the Imperium's most stable and prosperous regions through systematic exposure to warp energies that would permanently alter the local nature of reality. The betrayal at Kolth began with deceptions that exploited the trust and respect that had previously existed between the two legions. Lorgar's forces arriving under the pretense of joint operations, while actually preparing for coordinated strikes against unprepared Ultramarine positions. The initial assault achieved tactical surprise that enabled devastating casualties among Guilliman's warriors. But the true purpose of the campaign lay in the massive ritual configurations that word-bearer sorcerers had prepared across the system's inhabited worlds. The arcane geometries carved into planetary surfaces and asteroid fields created focusing mechanisms that channeled warp energies on an unprecedented scale, transforming local space into a conduit for forces that existed beyond material reality. The deaths of millions of Imperial citizens provided psychic fuel for these workings, while the corruption of ancient sites and sacred locations ensured that the spiritual damage would persist long after the military campaign concluded. Kolth became a wound in reality itself, a permanent gateway that would continue bleeding chaos influence into the Imperium for millennia to come. The word-bearers' performance during the broader heresy campaigns revealed how completely they had embraced their new identity as servants of cosmic transformation. Their tactical doctrines evolved to incorporate sorcerous support that gave them capabilities beyond those of conventional Space Marine forces, while their strategic objectives often prioritized symbolic and spiritual goals that seemed to contradict military efficiency. They fought not just to win battles, but to achieve specific forms of victory that advanced their divine patron's cosmic agenda. The Legion's internal organization adapted to accommodate the reality of serving multiple divine authorities whose interests and methods sometimes conflicted with each other. Different companies and chapters within the word-bearers began specializing in the worship and service of specific chaos gods, developing tactical approaches and ritual practices that reflected their patrons' particular characteristics and preferences. This fragmentation might have weakened other legions, but the word-bearers maintained unity through their shared commitment to the fundamental principle that all chaos powers serve the same ultimate purpose. The transformation of Imperial worlds under word-bearer occupation demonstrated the practical application of theological principles to governance and social organization. Populations were not simply enslaved or destroyed, but educated and converted to belief systems that made them willing participants in cosmic enterprises that transcended their individual welfare. The results were often more stable and productive than territories controlled through simple military force, though they came at the cost of fundamental changes to human nature itself. The emergence of daemon princes within the Legion's ranks represented the ultimate vindication of their theological innovations, proving that mortal beings could indeed achieve genuine divinity through proper service to cosmic powers. These ascended warriors retained their tactical knowledge and leadership capabilities while gaining supernatural abilities that made them living bridges between material reality and the warp. Their presence provided concrete evidence that the promises made by chaos entities were genuine rather than deceptive, encouraging continued loyalty and devotion from their former subordinates. The word-bearers' role in spreading corruption throughout the traitor forces extended far beyond their own legion, their theological expertise making them invaluable advisors and spiritual guides for other Primarchs who lacked their sophisticated understanding of chaos doctrine. They served as teachers and mentors who helped their allies understand how to balance service to divine patrons with practical military requirements, preventing the kind of spiritual conflicts that might have weakened the overall heresy effort. The systematic destruction of Imperial infrastructure carried out by word-bearer forces during this period was guided by strategic principles that prioritized targets based on their symbolic and spiritual significance rather than mere tactical value. Libraries, temples, and educational institutions received particular attention because they represented repositories of Imperial ideology that could sustain loyalist resistance even after military defeat. The goal was not just conquest but complete cultural transformation that would make restoration of Imperial authority impossible. The Legion's approach to dealing with loyalist Space Marines reflected their understanding. that the heresy represented more than a political rebellion, but a fundamental conflict between incompatible visions of humanity's cosmic destiny. Captured loyalists were not simply executed or imprisoned, but subjected to sophisticated conversion processes designed to break their conditioning and open their minds to alternative spiritual truths. The success rate was remarkably high, suggesting that many imperial warriors harbored doubts about the adequacy of secular doctrine that made them receptive to theological alternatives. As the heresy progressed toward its climactic phases, the word-bearers found themselves increasingly focused on preparing for outcomes that extended far beyond the immediate question of who would control the imperial throne. Their divine patrons had made clear that the true victory would come not through military conquest, but through permanent transformation of the galaxy's spiritual landscape that would make future resistance to chaos influence impossible. The war itself was merely a means of creating conditions necessary for cosmic change on an unprecedented scale. The approaching Siege of Terra represented the culmination of everything the word-bearers had worked towards since their first contact with powers beyond imperial understanding. The assault on humanity's homeworld would provide opportunities for ritual workings on a scale that could permanently alter the relationship between material reality and the warp, creating changes that would persist regardless of the campaign's immediate military outcome. They had become instruments of cosmic transformation whose true purpose transcended the immediate concerns of any merely human conflict. The Siege of Terra represented the ultimate test of everything the word-bearers had learned about the relationship between spiritual purpose and material warfare, their participation in humanity's greatest battle serving cosmic objectives that transcended the immediate question of who would claim the imperial throne. For Lorgar and his legion, the assault on the Emperor's homeworld was never primarily about conquest, but about creating conditions for ritual workings that could permanently alter the fundamental nature of reality itself throughout the galaxy. The word-bearers approached the siege with strategic priorities that often seemed to contradict conventional military wisdom, their forces assigned to objectives that maximized symbolic and spiritual significance rather than tactical advantage, while other traitor legions focused on breaking through defensive lines and capturing key installations. The XVII Legion concentrated on corrupting sacred sites and establishing ritual configurations that would channel warp energies into Terra's psychic infrastructure. Their true battlefield was not the planet's surface, but the spiritual dimensions that gave meaning to human existence. The Legion's deployment during the early phases of the siege reflected careful planning that had been years in development, their positions chosen to create geometric patterns that would serve as focusing mechanisms for cosmic forces beyond imperial understanding. Companies and chapters were stationed at locations corresponding to ancient sites of power that predated human habitation of Terra, places where the barriers between reality and the warp remained thin enough to permit direct manipulation through properly conducted ceremonies. The assault on the Imperial Palace represented perhaps the most challenging objective the word-bearers had ever attempted, requiring them to balance immediate military requirements with longer-term spiritual goals that demanded specific approaches to conquest and destruction. The palace was not just a fortress protecting the Emperor's physical form, but the symbolic heart of imperial ideology and the focal point for loyalist faith throughout the galaxy. Its corruption would deal psychological damage to imperial resistance that would persist long after the siege's conclusion. Lorgar's personal involvement in the siege demonstrated how completely he had embraced his transformation from loyal son to cosmic revolutionary. His presence on Terra representing both a rejection of his former identity and an assertion of the divine authority he had claimed through service to powers beyond imperial recognition. The Primarch who had once wept at his father's feet now stood before the Imperial Palace as an enemy whose spiritual evolution had elevated him above the limitations of mere filial loyalty. The word-bearers' tactical doctrine during the siege incorporated sorceress support on an unprecedented scale, their battles serving dual purposes as both military operations and massive ritual workings that fed energy to their divine patrons. Every assault was planned according to principles that treated enemy casualties as sacrificial offerings, while the destruction of imperial infrastructure was choreographed to create patterns that would resonate with cosmic forces dwelling beyond material reality. The breakthrough at the Eternity Gate demonstrated the effectiveness of combining conventional warfare with spiritual mechanics, the word-bearers' assault succeeding where pure military force had failed through the application of theological insights that turned imperial defenses against themselves. The massive blast doors that had withstood orbital bombardment and heavy weapons fire were breached through rituals that exploited the psychic resonance between the gate's symbolic significance and the faith of defenders who had invested it with spiritual meaning. The penetration of the inner palace represented the culmination of centuries of preparation and planning. The word bearers advancing through corridors where the Emperor's presence had shaped reality itself according to principles that their cosmic patrons sought to overthrow. Each chamber and hallway became a battleground where opposing visions of divine truth clashed through mechanisms that transcended purely physical conflict, with victory determined as much by spiritual conviction as by martial prowess. The word bearers' encounter with loyalist forces within the palace revealed the full extent of their transformation from imperial servants into something altogether alien to human understanding. Their former brothers among the loyalist legions found themselves facing warriors whose mutations and enhancements reflected direct connection to powers that violated every natural law that imperial science acknowledged. The resulting battles were as much theological debates conducted through violence as conventional military engagements. The systematic corruption of palace personnel and systems demonstrated the word bearers' sophisticated understanding of how spiritual influence could be weaponized against opponents who lacked adequate protection against supernatural assault. Imperial defenders found themselves questioning fundamental assumptions about reality and purpose, as chaos energies undermined their psychological conditioning and opened their minds to alternative interpretations of cosmic truth. The approach toward the throne room represented the ultimate objective of everything the word bearers had worked towards since their first contact with powers beyond imperial recognition. Their advance through the palace's innermost chambers bringing them closer to direct confrontation with the being whose rejection had initiated their spiritual evolution. The Emperor's physical location had become the focal point for cosmic forces that would determine not just the siege's outcome but the future relationship between humanity and the divine powers that shaped galactic destiny. The battles fought in the approaches to the throne room transcended conventional warfare to become direct manifestations of competing theological principles, each side drawing upon spiritual resources that gave their conflict cosmic significance beyond the immediate tactical situation. The word bearers fought not just to advance their positions but to prove the superiority of their divine patrons over the false god whose authority they challenged. The climactic moments of the siege found the word bearers positioned to witness the ultimate confrontation between Horus and the Emperor, their presence serving both as military support and spiritual observers whose theological insights would be necessary to understand the cosmic implications of whatever occurred. They had orchestrated events that would bring the galaxy's two greatest powers into direct conflict, creating conditions where fundamental questions about the nature of divinity and authority would be resolved through trial by combat. The War Master's assault on the Emperor represented the practical application of principles that the word bearers had spent decades developing and refining, their corruption of Horus having prepared him to serve as an instrument through which cosmic forces could directly challenge imperial authority. The battle itself was less important than what it symbolized about the relationship between mortal will and divine power, with the outcome determining which vision of humanity's spiritual destiny would prevail. The Emperor's victory over Horus, achieved through the complete destruction of his most favored son's physical and spiritual essence, demonstrated powers that exceeded anything the word bearers had anticipated from their former master. The display of absolute authority that reduced the War Master to nothing while simultaneously destroying the chaos entities that had empowered him revealed capabilities that forced even his most bitter enemies to acknowledge his claim to divine status. The immediate aftermath of Horus's death created tactical and spiritual crises that tested the word bearer's commitment to cosmic purposes that transcended immediate military success or failure. The collapse of traitor morale following the War Master's destruction forced them to choose between retreat and continued assault against opponents whose divine patron had just demonstrated superiority over their own supernatural allies. The decision to withdraw from Terra represented not defeat, but strategic recognition that their cosmic objectives required different approaches than direct military confrontation with powers that had proven capable of destroying even daemon princes and ascended primarchs. The word bearers understood that their true victory would come through patient corruption and gradual transformation rather than immediate conquest, requiring them to preserve their capabilities for longer-term campaigns against an enemy whose divine nature they now fully acknowledged. The retreat through the palace, and back toward their extraction points provided opportunities for final ritual workings that would ensure their efforts had not been entirely wasted despite the siege's military failure. The word-bearers planted spiritual corruption throughout the imperial palace that would persist long after their physical departure, creating ongoing vulnerabilities that future operations could exploit when conditions became more favorable. The evacuation from Terra marked the end of the word-bearers' service as architects of galactic rebellion, and their transformation into something altogether different, servants of cosmic forces, whose patience matched their determination to achieve ultimate victory over the false god who had temporarily preserved his authority through superior power. They had learned that their divine patron's plans operated on timescales that made immediate success less important than positioning for eventual triumph. The final departure from the Sol system represented both an ending and a beginning for the XVII Legion, their participation in humanity's greatest civil war having prepared them for roles as long-term agents of cosmic transformation. They had proven their worth as instruments of divine will while gaining insights into the true nature of the conflict between order and chaos that would guide their activities throughout the dark millennia to come. The retreat from Terra marked the beginning of the most desperate period in the word-bearers' existence, their status transformed overnight from architects of galactic revolution to hunted fugitives fleeing the wrath of an imperium determined to exact vengeance for the greatest betrayal in human history. The great scouring that followed the heresy's conclusion represented an existential threat that tested everything they had learned about survival, adaptation, and the maintenance of faith under impossible circumstances. The imperial forces pursuing them were driven by rage and righteousness that made negotiation or mercy impossible, their commanders viewing the traitor legions not as fellow humans who had chosen wrongly, but as cosmic abominations whose very existence threatened the stability of reality itself. The word-bearers found themselves facing opponents whose hatred had been refined through years of civil war into something approaching religious fervor, creating tactical situations where quarter was neither offered nor expected by either side. The fragmentation of traitor forces following Horus's death created opportunities and dangers that required careful navigation by Legion commanders, whose strategic thinking had been shaped by cosmic rather than purely military considerations. Different traitor factions pursued conflicting objectives as they fled toward the Eye of Terror, with some prioritizing immediate survival while others remained committed to longer-term goals that transcended the heresy's apparent failure. Lorgar's response to these challenges demonstrated how completely his perspective had been transformed by decades of service to powers whose patience matched their determination to achieve ultimate victory. While other Primarchs despaired over their defeat or raged against the injustice of their treatment, the word-bearer's master approached their exile with philosophical acceptance that reflected his understanding of cosmic purposes that operated on timescales far beyond mortal concerns. The Primarch's withdrawal from active leadership during the retreat created leadership vacuums that were filled by figures whose commitment to chaos doctrine had been proven through years of faithful service. Erebus and Corpheron emerged as the Legion's primary strategic voices, their guidance shaped by direct communication with divine patrons whose instructions provided clarity about priorities and objectives that transcended immediate tactical considerations. The establishment of the First Chaplain and Dark Apostle hierarchy represented a fundamental reorganization of Legion command structure that reflected theological rather than purely military principles. These new positions combined traditional leadership responsibilities with spiritual authority that made their holders responsible for maintaining doctrinal purity and cosmic purpose, even under conditions of extreme stress and isolation. The journey toward the Eye of Terror became a pilgrimage as much as a retreat, with each system traversed providing opportunities for recruitment, resupply, and spiritual renewal that prepared the Legion for their new existence as servants of powers dwelling beyond imperial reach. The word-bearers used their theological expertise to identify populations whose beliefs and circumstances made them receptive to chaos corruption, building networks of support that would sustain their operations throughout the coming millennia. The transformation of Legion logistics and organization during this period reflected hard-won lessons about the requirements for maintaining effective military force while serving divine patrons, whose support came with obligations that conventional armies could never understand. Supply chains were reorganized around ritual requirements as much as material needs, while personnel policies were adapted to accommodate the reality of serving alongside demons and other supernatural entities. The word-bearers' approach to recruitment during their exile demonstrated sophisticated understanding of human psychology and spiritual needs that made them remarkably effective at converting imperial citizens to their cause. They offered meaning and purpose that secular imperial ideology seemed unable to provide, appealing to populations whose faith had been shaken by the Civil War's devastation and the obvious failure of imperial promises about humanity's glorious destiny. The establishment of hidden bases and supply depots throughout imperial space required operational security measures that combined conventional military tradecraft with spiritual protections derived from chaos doctrine. These installations served multiple purposes as staging areas for future operations, recruitment centers for new converts, and ritual sites that maintained the Legion's connection to their divine patrons despite physical separation from the warp storms surrounding the Eye of Terror. The Legion's internal culture evolved rapidly during this period, as officers and enlisted personnel adapted to circumstances that would have broken conventional military units. The theological education that had always distinguished word-bearers from other legions proved invaluable for maintaining morale and unit cohesion when traditional sources of military identity and purpose had been stripped away by defeat and exile. The development of new tactical doctrines reflected the reality of fighting as insurgents rather than conventional military force, with emphasis shifting toward operations that maximize spiritual as well as material impact. Raids were planned to corrupt enemy populations rather than simply inflicting casualties, while defensive actions were designed to demonstrate the power and protection that chaos patronage could provide to potential converts. The word-bearers' relationship with other traitor legions during the retreat was complicated by theological differences that had been suppressed during the heresy, but now emerged as serious sources of conflict. Their sophisticated understanding of chaos doctrine often put them at odds with former allies whose approach to divine service lacked the intellectual rigor and spiritual discipline that the XVII Legion considered essential for long-term success. The arrival in the Eye of Terror represented both sanctuary and transformation for the Legion. Their entry into regions where warp energies shaped reality according to divine will rather than natural law. The environment itself became an active participant in their continued evolution, its influence accelerating mutations and spiritual changes that would prepare them for roles that transcended their original nature as Space Marines. The selection of daemon worlds for permanent bases required careful evaluation of cosmic factors that determined which locations would best serve their long-term strategic objectives. Each potential site offered different advantages and challenges based on the nature of its ruling entities and the specific forms of chaos influence that dominated local reality, with final decisions reflecting theological as much as tactical considerations. The construction of fortress monasteries that would serve as spiritual centers for their exile operations demonstrated the word-bearers' commitment to maintaining institutional continuity, despite the dramatic changes in their circumstances and nature. These installations combined defensive capabilities with ritual facilities that would enable continued communication with divine patrons and the conduct of ceremonies necessary for sustaining their cosmic mission. The fragmentation of the Legion into smaller warbands and chapters reflected both practical necessities and theological innovations that distributed responsibility for maintaining chaos doctrine across multiple semi-independent organizations. This structure proved remarkably resilient in the face of Imperial counter-operations, while maintaining enough coordination to support major initiatives when circumstances required unified action. The emergence of new leadership figures during this period reflected the democratic character of theological advancement within chaos organizations, where authority derived from spiritual insight and divine favor rather than mere military rank or political appointment. Dark apostles and word-bearer sorcerers gained influence based on their ability to interpret cosmic will and implement divine guidance effectively under challenging conditions. The establishment of recruitment and training programs designed to integrate new converts into Legion culture represented one of the word-bearers' most significant innovations during their early exile. These systems combined traditional military instruction with theological education that prepared recruits for service to divine patrons whose expectations and requirements differed fundamentally from those of secular military organizations. The development of long-term strategic planning that anticipated campaigns spanning centuries or millennia reflected the word-bearers' understanding that their cosmic mission required patience and persistence that exceeded anything demanded by conventional warfare. Their divine patrons had waited millions of years to achieve their objectives, creating expectations about timescales and success metrics that human military thinking was poorly equipped to comprehend. The legacy of these early exile experiences would shape word-bearer culture throughout the 10 millennia that followed, establishing patterns of organization, belief, and operation that would enable them to remain effective servants of chaos despite countless setbacks and defeats. They had learned to measure success in cosmic rather than merely tactical terms, understanding that their true victory would come through the gradual transformation of galactic civilization rather than immediate military conquest. The 10 millennia that followed the Horus Heresy would prove that the word-bearers had achieved a victory far more profound than simple military conquest could ever have provided. Their theological innovations reshaping human civilization throughout the galaxy in ways that validated every principle they had fought to establish. The Imperium that emerged from the Civil War bore little resemblance to the secular empire that the Emperor had originally envisioned, having been transformed into the very kind of religious state that Lorgar had always believed represented humanity's natural and proper form of government. The Imperial Cult that came to dominate human society represented the ultimate vindication of word-bearer theology, their original insights about the Emperor's divine nature finally achieving official recognition despite centuries of resistance from imperial authorities. The Lectitio Divinitatis, written by Lorgar during his years of faithful service, became the foundational text for a religious movement that encompassed trillions of human souls across hundreds of thousands of worlds. The irony was perfect and complete. The Emperor had finally received the worship he had rejected, but only after that rejection had driven his most devoted son into the arms of powers that offered the spiritual fulfillment that imperial doctrine had denied. The transformation of imperial government from secular administration to theocratic hierarchy represented changes that went far beyond mere political reorganization to encompass fundamental alterations in how human beings understood their relationship to authority, purpose, and cosmic meaning. The ecclesiarchy that came to wield enormous influence over imperial policy operated according to principles that would have been immediately recognizable to any word-bearer, treating secular concerns as subordinate to spiritual obligations that transcended material considerations. The propagation of religious doctrine throughout imperial space created populations whose psychological conditioning and cultural assumptions made them remarkably vulnerable to the kind of corruption that the word-bearers had perfected during their years of exile. Worlds whose inhabitants had been taught to view the Emperor as divine could be more easily convinced that other, more accessible deities might offer superior forms of spiritual fulfillment. The very faith that imperial authorities had cultivated as a source of loyalty became a weapon that could be turned against them by enemies who understood its mechanisms and vulnerabilities. The emergence of chaos cults throughout imperial territory represented the practical application of recruitment techniques that the XVII Legion had developed during their compliance campaigns, adapted for use against populations whose religious conditioning made them receptive to alternative theological explanations. These organizations served multiple purposes as intelligence networks, recruitment pools, and staging areas for operations that gradually weakened imperial control while strengthening chaos influence throughout human space. The word-bearers' role in coordinating and supporting these cult activities demonstrated their evolution from conventional military force into something approaching a galactic intelligence service whose operations transcended traditional concepts of warfare and conquest. Their agents operated within imperial institutions at every level, from planetary governments to the highest echelons of the ecclesiarchy itself, creating networks of influence that could be activated when circumstances required coordinated action against imperial authority. The long-term corruption campaigns conducted by the Legion over the centuries, following their exile, achieved results that exceeded anything that immediate military conquest could have accomplished. Their patient subversion creating vulnerabilities that would persist regardless of short-term tactical victories or defeats. Entire sectors gradually shifted their allegiance from the Emperor to chaos deities through processes so gradual that imperial authorities often failed to recognize the transformation until it was too late to reverse through conventional means. The development of new recruitment and training methodologies allowed the word-bearers to maintain and expand their numbers despite operating under conditions of constant pressure from imperial counterintelligence operations. Their theological schools produced converts whose dedication and capability often exceeded that of imperial personnel, creating asymmetric advantages that compensated for their numerical disadvantages relative to loyalist forces. The Legion's influence on other Chaos forces throughout the galaxy reflected their unique position as theological authorities whose expertise in spiritual matters made them valuable allies and advisors for entities whose motivations and methods remained alien to conventional understanding. Their ability to serve as interpreters and intermediaries between mortal servants and divine patrons created relationships that enhanced their own capabilities while advancing the broader cause of Chaos expansion throughout human space. The technological innovations that emerged from word-bearer research into the intersection between spiritual and material reality produced weapons and equipment that gave them significant advantages over opponents who remained limited by purely secular understanding of natural law. Their artificers learned to craft items that channeled warp energies directly, creating tools whose effectiveness derived from theological principles rather than mere mechanical engineering. The cultural impact of word-bearer activities extended far beyond their direct military operations to encompass changes in art, literature, philosophy, and popular culture that gradually shifted human consciousness toward acceptance of Chaos concepts and assumptions. Their agents working within imperial educational and cultural institutions promoted interpretations of history, science, and theology that normalized ideas about divine plurality, spiritual evolution, and the legitimacy of alternative religious authorities. The establishment of permanent bases and installations throughout the galaxy created infrastructure that supported not just military operations, but comprehensive programs for cultural transformation that operated on timescales measured in centuries rather than years. These facilities served as centers for research, training, and coordination that enabled the Legion to maintain strategic coherence despite being scattered across vast distances and operating under conditions of extreme secrecy. The word-bearer's relationship with the ruinous powers evolved over the millennia, from simple service towards something approaching partnership, their demonstrated competence and reliability earning them privileges and responsibilities that were denied to less sophisticated servants of Chaos. This enhanced status provided access to knowledge and resources that further increased their effectiveness while expanding their understanding of cosmic purposes that transcended immediate tactical concerns. The emergence of new generations of word-bearer leaders who had never known service to the Imperium represented both opportunity and challenge for the Legion's continued effectiveness. These figures brought perspectives shaped entirely by Chaos doctrine, but lacked the first-hand experience of imperial society that had made their predecessors so effective at subversion and corruption. Training programs were developed to provide them with the cultural knowledge necessary for operating against opponents whose psychology and assumptions they had never directly experienced. The Legion's influence on the development of Chaos doctrine throughout the galaxy reflected their unique position as both theological innovators and practical operators, whose understanding of human nature had been refined through millennia of successful recruitment and conversion operations. Their insights about the relationship between faith and political loyalty informed strategies employed by Chaos forces throughout the galaxy, contributing to the steady erosion of imperial authority that characterized the later periods of imperial history. The integration of demonic allies into word-bearer operations represented technological and theological innovations that enhanced their capabilities while creating new forms of military organization that transcended traditional distinctions between mortal and supernatural forces. These hybrid units combine the tactical flexibility of human troops with the supernatural capabilities of warp entities, creating formations whose effectiveness exceeded what either component could achieve independently. The long-term consequences of word-bearer activities became most apparent during major Chaos incursions and Black Crusades, when their decades or centuries of preparatory work enabled coordinated uprisings that dramatically amplified the effectiveness of conventional military operations. Worlds that appeared loyal to imperial authority revealed themselves to be thoroughly corrupted when the appropriate signals were given, creating strategic surprises that repeatedly caught imperial defenders unprepared for the scale and coordination of Chaos attacks. The ultimate measure of word-bearer success lay not in any single victory or achievement, but in the fundamental transformation of galactic civilization that made Chaos corruption a permanent and growing threat to human survival. They had succeeded in their original mission of bringing humanity into proper relationship with divine authority, though not in the form that their younger selves would have anticipated or approved. The galaxy had become a battleground between competing visions of divine truth, with the outcome remaining uncertain after 10 millennia of conflict that showed no signs of resolution through conventional means. The word-bearers of the 41st and 42nd millennia represent the culmination of 10,000 years of theological evolution and spiritual refinement, Their activities in the contemporary galaxy revealing the full scope of their transformation from loyal servants into cosmic architects of humanity's ultimate spiritual destiny. Recent events across the galaxy demonstrate that their patient campaign of corruption and conversion has reached critical thresholds that threaten to fundamentally alter the balance of power between order and chaos throughout human space. The return of Robert Guilliman to active leadership of the Imperium has created both opportunities and challenges for word-bearer operations that require careful strategic adaptation to new circumstances. The resurrection of their ancient enemy represents a threat to networks of influence that have been centuries in development, but also provides opportunities for demonstrating the futility of attempting to restore imperial authority through secular means in a galaxy that has been fundamentally transformed by spiritual forces beyond mortal comprehension. Intelligence reports from across the galaxy suggest that word-bearer activities have intensified dramatically since the opening of the Great Rift. Their operations coordinated on a scale that implies preparation for events whose scope and significance remain unclear to imperial authorities. The emergence of new chaos cults in regions that had previously shown exemplary loyalty indicates that their recruitment efforts have achieved unprecedented penetration of imperial society at every level, from planetary governance to the highest echelons of the ecclesiarchy itself. The theological innovations that have emerged from word-bearer research facilities hidden throughout the galaxy represent advances in spiritual technology that combine ancient chaos doctrine with insights derived from contemporary developments in psychic phenomena and warp manipulation. These discoveries have produced weapons, rituals, and organizational techniques that give modern word-bearer forces capabilities that far exceed what their predecessors possessed during the Horus Heresy era. The Legion's current organizational structure reflects sophisticated adaptation to the realities of operating in a galaxy where Imperial counterintelligence capabilities have evolved to match the threat that chaos infiltration represents. Modern word-bearer cells operate with levels of compartmentalization and operational security that make comprehensive Imperial response extremely difficult, while maintaining enough coordination to support major initiatives when circumstances require unified action across multiple sectors. The emergence of new generation Dark Apostles, who combine traditional theological authority with cutting-edge understanding of contemporary imperial society, has created leadership cadres whose effectiveness exceeds anything the Legion has previously achieved. These figures possess intellectual frameworks that integrate millennia of chaos doctrine with detailed knowledge of current imperial weaknesses and vulnerabilities, enabling them to design corruption campaigns that exploit specific characteristics of modern human civilization. The word-bearer's role in recent Black Crusades demonstrates their evolution from support elements to primary strategic architects whose theological insights guide operational planning for chaos forces throughout the galaxy. Their understanding of imperial psychology and institutional vulnerabilities makes them invaluable for coordinating multi-pronged attacks that combine military pressure with spiritual subversion to achieve results that neither approach could accomplish independently. The corruption of entire Space Marine chapters through word-bearer influence represents perhaps their most significant contemporary achievement, proving that even the Emperor's most elite servants remain vulnerable to spiritual subversion when properly approached by adversaries who understand the psychological foundations of loyalty and faith. These successes demonstrate that imperial conditioning methods have fundamental flaws that skilled theological manipulators can exploit regardless of the target's apparent dedication to imperial doctrine. The establishment of hidden seminaries and training facilities throughout imperial space has created educational infrastructure that produces converts whose capabilities and dedication often exceed those of legitimate imperial personnel. These institutions combine traditional word-bearer theological instruction with specialized training in contemporary imperial procedures and protocols, enabling graduates to operate effectively within enemy organizations while advancing chaos objectives. The word-bearer's influence on the development of contemporary chaos doctrine extends far beyond their own legion to encompass theoretical frameworks and practical methodologies that are employed by chaos forces throughout the galaxy. Their research into the relationship between faith and political control has produced insights that inform corruption campaigns conducted by entities whose motivations and methods remain alien to human understanding. The technological capabilities that modern word-bearer forces have developed through their research into daemon tech integration represent significant advances over conventional Imperial equipment, providing tactical advantages that compensate for their numerical disadvantages relative to Loyalist forces. These innovations demonstrate successful synthesis of spiritual and material engineering principles that Imperial authorities consider theoretically impossible according to their understanding of natural law. The emergence of hybrid organizations that combine word-bearer leadership with local chaos cult resources has created force structures that are remarkably effective at exploiting regional vulnerabilities, while maintaining enough flexibility to adapt rapidly to changing circumstances. These formations represent organizational innovations that transcend traditional military hierarchies to create something approaching living weapons whose effectiveness derives from spiritual as well as tactical capabilities. The word-bearers' relationship with other chaos factions in the contemporary galaxy reflects their position as theological authorities whose expertise in spiritual matters makes them valuable allies, despite potential conflicts over immediate tactical objectives. Their ability to serve as mediators and interpreters between different chaos entities has created collaborative relationships that enhance the overall effectiveness of anti-imperial operations throughout human space. Recent discoveries of word-bearer archaeological sites on worlds that were supposedly brought into Imperial compliance millennia ago suggest that their influence has been far more extensive and persistent than Imperial authorities previously understood. These installations contain evidence of corruption campaigns that operated continuously for thousands of years, creating vulnerabilities that remain exploitable despite apparent Imperial control over the affected territories. The psychological warfare capabilities that modern word-bearer forces have developed represent sophisticated understanding of contemporary Imperial culture and the specific anxieties and concerns that characterize different segments of human society. Their propaganda and recruitment materials are precisely calibrated to exploit psychological vulnerabilities that have been created by 10 millennia of Imperial indoctrination, and the growing awareness that official promises about humanity's glorious destiny have failed to materialize. The implications of word-bearer activities for the galaxy's future extend far beyond immediate military concerns to encompass fundamental questions about the sustainability of Imperial civilization in its current form. Their patient campaign of spiritual subversion has created conditions where major portions of human space could potentially shift allegiance to chaos with relatively little external pressure, representing strategic vulnerabilities that threaten the very foundations of Imperial authority. The theological questions raised by word-bearer success challenge basic assumptions about human nature, divine authority, and the relationship between secular governance and spiritual fulfillment that have shaped Imperial policy for 10 millennia. Their demonstration that faith-based organizations can achieve superior results compared to secular alternatives forces uncomfortable re-examination of ideological foundations that Imperial leadership has long considered beyond question. The word-bearers' ultimate legacy may prove to be their role in demonstrating that the conflict between order and chaos cannot be resolved through purely military means, but requires engagement with spiritual dimensions of existence that Imperial doctrine has consistently denied or ignored. They have forced recognition that human beings possess psychological and spiritual needs that secular ideology cannot adequately address, creating vulnerabilities that will persist regardless of tactical victories or defeats in conventional warfare. The contemporary galaxy bears witness to the fulfillment of prophecies that Lorgar spoke during his darkest moments of exile, when he predicted that humanity would eventually embrace the spiritual truths that Imperial doctrine had rejected. The Emperor sits upon his golden throne as the object of worship that he once forbade, while his former enemies work tirelessly to complete the theological revolution that began with their first contact with powers dwelling beyond the veil of material reality. In the grim darkness of the far future, the word-bearers remain humanity's most patient and persistent enemies, their activities guided by cosmic purposes that operate on timescales far beyond mortal comprehension. They have proven that absolute faith, when properly directed, can indeed move mountains and reshape civilizations, though not always in ways that their original believers would recognize or approve. The galaxy continues to burn with the fires of their theological revolution, and there is no indication that this cosmic conflict will ever truly end.